The year is 150 CE. Frost clings to the cobblestones of Rome like a second skin, glittering under a moon that offers light but no warmth. Wind cuts through the forum, threading between marble columns that stand as frozen sentinels in the darkness. Somewhere in the distance, a shutter bangs against stone. The eternal city sleeps, but sleep in winter Rome was never easy. The cold didn't respect marble or empire. It crept through walls, settled into bones, and tested every soul from senator to slave. Imagine waking in that world. No thermostat on the wall, no electric blanket waiting at the foot of your bed, no insulated windows or central heating humming through hidden vents. Just you, the dark, and a cold that could kill if you weren't careful. Millions of Romans face this reality every winter, year after year. Generation after generation. They built aqueducts that still stand today. They engineered roads that connected an empire. They raised the Colosseum, a monument to human ambition that defies time itself. Yet when night fell and winter descended, these masters of stone and engineering faced a challenge more intimate and relentless than any military campaign. How did they survive? It's a question that haunts the ruins. We walk through Pompeii and marvel at frescoes. We study their laws, their wars, their literature. But we rarely ask the most human question of all. How did they sleep through winter without freezing to death? The answer isn't in the grand monuments. It's hidden in the details we've overlooked, buried in archaeological fragments, encrypted in passing mentions in ancient texts. Roman winters could be brutal. In the city itself, temperatures dropped below freezing. In the northern territories, Britannia, Germania, the Alpine regions, soldiers and settlers faced conditions that would challenge anyone today, even with modern gear. What if the Romans knew something we've forgotten? What if their survival depended on techniques, social practices, and knowledge that vanished when central heating arrived? Historians are only now beginning to piece together the full picture, and what they're discovering challenges everything we assumed about comfort, community, and human resilience. The Romans didn't just endure winter, they developed an entire architecture of warmth, physical, social, and psychological strategies woven together into a system that kept an empire alive through countless frozen seasons. Some of these methods were technological, others were behavioral, many were social, revealing hierarchies we can still trace in the archaeological record. The way Romans slept, the warmth they shared or hoarded, the risks they took and the choices they made. All of it tells a story about survival that textbooks rarely mention. This isn't just history, it's a lost manual for endurance written by people who had no choice but to master winter or die trying. The Roman Empire wasn't a single climate, it was a patchwork of extremes stitched together by roads and legions, stretching from sun-scorched sand to permafrost. At its height, Rome commanded territory that spanned 3 continents and every variation of weather the ancient world could offer. In Egypt, the Nile Delta shimmered under heat that could kill by noon. In Britannia, soldiers on Hadrian's Wall woke to frost thick enough to snap leather and winds that cut through wool like it wasn't there. This was the reality of empire, not just conquest, but survival across landscapes that had no mercy for the unprepared. Consider the soldiers stationed at York, deep in the north of Britannia. Winter there brought sub-zero temperatures, sleet that turned to ice on contact, and darkness that lasted longer than the daylight. These men weren't visiting, they lived there, year after year, guarding a frontier that stretched across the width of the island. Or think of the families in the Alpine passes, Roman settlers who traded Mediterranean warmth for mountain cold because the empire needed outposts, needed control. Their children grew up watching snow accumulate on rooftops, learning to read the sky for the next storm. Even Rome itself, the heart of the empire, faced winters that modern tourists never see. The city empties out in winter now, but in ancient times there was no escape. January and February brought cold rains, damp that seeped into stone, and nights where breath fogged in unheated rooms. The Tiber could freeze at its edges. Frost settled on the 7 hills, and unlike the wealthy who could retreat to heated rooms, the majority endured in apartment blocks where fire was forbidden and walls were thin. Archaeological evidence keeps expanding our understanding of just how far into hostile territory Rome pushed. Forts have been discovered in Scotland, beyond even Hadrian's Wall, where conditions were harsher still. Along the Danube and Rhine rivers, military outposts marked the empire's northern edge, and winter there was a siege that lasted months. Temperatures regularly plummeted, rivers froze. In the winter of 101 CE, the Danube turned to solid ice, thick enough that entire barbarian tribes crossed on foot, a terrifying reminder that nature could erase Rome's carefully drawn borders when the temperature dropped low enough. Julius Caesar documented winter campaigns in Gaul, describing conditions that killed men as efficiently as any enemy. Soldiers dug into frozen ground, supplies ran low. The cold became another adversary, invisible but relentless. These weren't isolated incidents. Winter was an annual challenge that every corner of the empire faced in different but equally demanding ways. And this is where the story deepens. Because survival wasn't equal, wealthy Romans lived in villas with hypercore systems, underfloor heating powered by slave-tended furnaces. They slept under imported furs and fine wool. They had options, but the vast majority didn't. Poor Romans crowded into insulae, multi-story apartment buildings where open flames were banned due to fire risk. They had no heating, no insulation worth mentioning, just thin walls, cold stone, and whatever body heat they could generate or share. Winter mortality rates tell the story statistics can't fully capture. The poor died more. The enslaved died more. Children and the elderly died more. Winter wasn't just uncomfortable, it was a filter, a test that not everyone passed. The empire's survival depended on enough people making it through to spring, enough bodies to work, to fight, to keep the machinery of civilization running. Yet they did survive, millions of them, across climates that ranged from merely difficult to actively hostile. The Romans developed solutions, some ingenious, some brutal, all practical. They learned to read winter, to prepare for it, to endure it with a combination of technology, tradition, and sheer stubborn resilience. The methods varied by location and class, but the imperative was universal: master winter, or winter masters you. Picture two Roman boys on the same winter night, separated by a few hundred meters and an entire world. The first sleeps in a chamber warmed by heated air flowing beneath marble floors. His bed frame is carved wood, his mattress stuffed with wool so fine it could have come from sheep raised specifically for softness. Fur coverlets, bear perhaps or wolf, layer over linen sheets. A slave checked the room an hour before bedtime, ensuring the hypercore system was burning steadily, that the warmth rose evenly, that the young master would wake comfortable. This boy will never know what it means to shiver through a night. The second boy sleeps in an attic room of an insula 6 stories above the street. The walls are thin, the window is a hole covered with oiled cloth that does almost nothing to stop the wind. He shares this space with his parents, 2 siblings, and sometimes a neighbour's family when their room becomes uninhabitable. There is no heat. Open flames are illegal here. Too many buildings have burned. Too many families killed in fires that consumed entire blocks. They huddle together under threadbare blankets, using their own bodies as furnaces, and hope morning comes quickly. This was Rome, not the Rome of marble fantasies and togas in sunlight, but the real city where survival itself stratified along class lines as clearly as any legal code. Warmth wasn't just comfort, it was a statement, a privilege, a boundary that separated human experiences so completely that these two boys might as well have lived in different civilizations. Roman society was layered like sediment, patricians at the top, their wealth measured in generations, equestrians below them, Rome's business class, then plebeians, the common citizens, freedmen, former slaves carving out precarious new lives, and finally the enslaved, whose bodies were property and whose comfort mattered only insofar as it affected their work. Winter revealed these divisions with brutal clarity. You could legislate equality, philosophize about shared humanity, but when the temperature dropped, every person's true status was written in how they slept. Wealthy Romans lived in domus, private homes built around courtyards with rooms designed for different seasons. They owned multiple properties and could move between them as weather dictated. Their hypercore systems, when functioning, heated entire floors. They purchased braziers made of bronze or silver, burning charcoal that produced steady heat with minimal smoke. Their textiles were imported: Egyptian linen, wool from Tarentum known for its quality, silk that travelled the length of the world to drape their sleeping couches. Some kept enslaved workers whose sole winter duty was warming beds before their masters retired, lying in the cold sheets until body heat made them tolerable, then departing so the master could sleep in warmth they'd created but would never enjoy themselves. For the enslaved, winter was survival without resources. They slept in the coldest parts of houses, in outbuildings, in quarters that were afterthoughts in architectural plans. Many had single blankets, worn clothing, and nothing else. Their survival depended on proximity, pressing together, sharing what little warmth their bodies could generate, enduring because there was no alternative. The middle existed too, though history focuses less on them: shopkeepers, craftsmen, minor officials, Romans who weren't wealthy but weren't destitute either. They lived in better insulae, ground-floor apartments where some warmth rose from shops below. They could afford wool, perhaps a decent blanket, maybe access to public baths where they could warm themselves before sleep. They knew techniques, tricks, traditions passed down about surviving without luxury. This knowledge crossed class boundaries more easily than wealth did. Roman writers documented this divide with fascinating contradiction. Seneca, the Stoic philosopher, praised endurance and simple living, arguing that excessive comfort weakened character. He wrote essays celebrating cold baths and sparse accommodations. Yet he also owned multiple villas with advanced heating systems. He described them in letters, detailing architectural features designed to capture warmth. The Romans understood their own hypocrisy. They valued toughness philosophically while pursuing comfort practically. Military training deliberately included cold exposure, building tolerance that served soldiers on frozen frontiers. But that same military system ensured officers slept warmer than common legionaries. What's remarkable isn't the inequality that existed everywhere in the ancient world. What's remarkable is that techniques for survival existed across these boundaries. Knowledge about layering, about body heat, about timing and preparation, these weren't secrets locked in villas. They circulated, adapted, evolved through every level of society. The wealthy had technology, the poor had ingenuity, and somewhere in between, in the accumulated wisdom of generations, lay methods that kept millions alive through winters that would have killed them otherwise. The question isn't whether Romans were comfortable. Most weren't. The question is how they survived anyway, and what that survival required from them, physically, socially, psychologically. Because winter didn't care about status. Cold killed patrician and slave alike if they failed to respect it. The difference was simply how many resources you had to fight back. In 1755, workers digging in the English town of Bath struck something unexpected beneath the earth, a floor that wasn't resting on ground but floating above it, held up by hundreds of small brick pillars arranged in perfect rows. They had found a Roman bathhouse, perfectly preserved, and beneath it, a system so sophisticated that it would take decades to fully understand. The hypercaust, Rome's hidden fire, a technology that turned entire buildings into gentle ovens, warming stone from below, circulating heat through walls, creating comfort that wouldn't be matched again until the industrial age reinvented what Romans had known nearly 2,000 years earlier. The principle was elegant. A furnace called a prefernium burned outside the main structure, wood or charcoal fed continuously by workers who understood that consistent heat mattered more than intense bursts. Hot air and smoke from this furnace didn't escape immediately. Instead, they were channeled beneath the floor, which wasn't a floor at all in the traditional sense, but a suspended platform. Stone or tile rested on top of short pillars, pilae, creating a hidden space where heat could flow. The hot air moved through this gap, warming the floor above, radiating upward into the room. But Romans didn't stop there. They built cavities into walls, vertical channels that allowed heat to rise further, warming rooms from floor to ceiling. Adjustable vents controlled the flow, letting inhabitants regulate temperature with precision that seems almost modern. This wasn't guesswork. Romans understood thermodynamics without the vocabulary for it. They knew heat rises, they knew air expands when heated, and that expansion creates movement. They designed draft systems that pulled fresh air into furnaces and exhausted smoke through carefully positioned chimneys. Different regions developed variations. Some hypercausts used water pipes instead of just air, creating humidity as well as warmth. Others incorporated double wall systems that insulated better, held heat longer, required less fuel. The sophistication varied, suggesting either lost innovations or knowledge that remained localized, never spreading empire-wide before circumstances changed and the need disappeared. Public baths depended on hypercausts. These weren't just places to wash, they were social centers, equalizers where citizens of different classes shared space. The baths required tremendous heat, not just for comfort, but to maintain the caldarium, the hot room, at temperatures high enough to induce sweating. Hypocausts made this possible. They heated massive volumes of water and kept multiple rooms at different temperatures simultaneously. A bather could move from tepidarium to caldarium to frigidarium, experiencing temperature variations that wouldn't exist without sophisticated climate control. Wealthy villas incorporated hypercausts into private wings. The Villa of the Mysteries outside Pompeii preserves one such system, frozen by volcanic ash in 79 CE. You can still see the pilae, the floor suspended above them, the channels where heat once flowed. Walking through those ruins, it's clear this wasn't primitive. The engineering is precise, the execution is careful. Someone understood exactly what they were building and why. These weren't the only examples. Villas across the empire, in Britain, Gaul, Germania, North Africa, show hypercaust variations adapted to local conditions and available materials. Military barracks sometimes had them too, particularly in frontier regions where keeping soldiers healthy through winter was strategic necessity. A garrison that froze was a garrison that couldn't fight. Rome invested in soldier welfare not from compassion but pragmatism, and hypocausts were part of that calculation. Officers' quarters were heated. Some barracks for common soldiers had communal heated rooms. The distribution solution wasn't equal, but it existed, recognition that winter could defeat legions as thoroughly as any barbarian army. But there were costs. Hypocausts consumed fuel voraciously. A single villa system might require cartloads of wood daily, and charcoal, which burned hotter and cleaner, was expensive. Forests near cities were depleted partly to feed these furnaces. Someone had to tend them constantly. The enslaved worked through nights feeding fires, adjusting airflow, ensuring heat remained steady. If they slept, the system failed. If they miscalculated, rooms became too hot or cooled dangerously. And there were risks beyond fuel. Smoke contained carbon monoxide. Without proper ventilation, rooms could fill with invisible poison. People died from it, not often enough to abandon the technology, but frequently enough that Roman medical writers documented the symptoms and warned about closed spaces with smouldering fires. Installation was expensive, maintenance demanding, and access restricted. Most Romans never lived in a hypocaust heated space. For them, this technology was something experienced at public baths or glimpsed in wealthy homes where they worked as labourers or servants. It represented a level of comfort they would never personally possess. The hypocaust was revolutionary, yes, but it was also a luxury, a marker of the gap between those who could afford warmth and those who endured without it. And here's what haunts archaeologists. Some hypocaust designs are more advanced than others, incorporating features that suggest experimentation, refinement, innovation that might have continued if history hadn't interrupted. When the Western Empire collapsed, this knowledge didn't disappear immediately. Some hypocausts kept functioning for decades, even centuries in certain regions. But eventually, the expertise faded, the fuel supply chains broke, the enslaved workforce that maintained them dispersed. By medieval times, Europeans had forgotten how to build them. Monasteries occasionally stumbled onto Roman hypocausts during construction and had no idea what they were looking at. 1,000 years of winter passed before central heating was reinvented, using different principles, different fuels, different engineering, effective but not necessarily superior to what Rome had already achieved. Yet even in Rome's height, hypocausts heated a minority of spaces. Most buildings had nothing like them. Most Romans slept cold. The hypocaust was an answer, but not the answer. It was one tool in a larger strategy, and for the majority who lacked access to it, survival required entirely different approaches. The question that remains is this: if the elite had hypocausts and the poor had nothing, what existed in between? What techniques, what knowledge, what practices allowed millions to survive winters without Rome's most advanced heating technology? The answer lies not in floors and furnaces, but in the cramped, cold, desperate architecture where most Romans actually lived. Step inside a Roman insula on a January morning, and the first thing that strikes you isn't what you see, it's what you feel. Cold radiating from stone walls like they're storing winter itself, air that bites exposed skin. Drafts finding every gap in shutters that were never quite fitted properly, whistling through cracks in ways that make sleep difficult and rest incomplete. These buildings rose 6, sometimes 7 stories above Rome's streets, towering structures that housed the city's multitudes in conditions that ranged from merely uncomfortable to genuinely dangerous. Most Romans lived here, not in villas with heated floors and private courtyards, but in these cramped vertical labyrinths where every floor brought new compromises. The ground level was commercial, shops, taverns, workshops that generated some residual warmth and made those spaces more valuable. The first residential floor above wasn't bad. Ceilings were higher, rooms slightly larger, and heat from businesses below rose just enough to take the edge off winter nights. But climb higher and conditions deteriorated with every step. Second floor, third floor, fourth, each level colder, cheaper, more precarious. The top floors were where the desperately poor lived, where families crowded into single rooms, where the ceiling leaked and the walls were thin enough to hear neighbours coughing through the night. No heating. That's the detail that defines everything else. Fire regulations in Rome were strict, born from experience with conflagrations that had consumed entire neighbourhoods. Open flames were forbidden in most insulae. No braziers, no hearths, nothing that could tip over or spark or spread. The logic was sound. These buildings were tinderboxes, wood-framed despite their concrete facades, packed with people and combustible materials. One fire could kill hundreds. So the city chose cold over catastrophe, leaving residents to survive winter with nothing but walls and blankets between them and the elements. The walls themselves offered little help. Insulae were built quickly and cheaply, investment properties for landlords who maximized profit by minimizing quality. Insulation didn't exist in any meaningful sense. Concrete and brick held cold as effectively as they held heat, and in winter they held cold. Windows were holes, sometimes covered with wooden shutters, sometimes with oiled cloth or thin animal membranes that let in dim light, but did almost nothing against wind. Glass existed, but glass was expensive, a luxury that belonged in bathhouses and wealthy homes, not in apartments rented to the working poor. Ostia Antica, Rome's ancient port, preserves insulae that archaeologists can walk through today. The structures remain remarkably intact, offering evidence that written sources only hint at. Room sizes that seem impossible for families of 5 or 6, stairways so narrow that moving furniture must have been nearly impossible, walls thin enough that you could probably punch through if you tried. Standing in those ruins, even in modern daylight with no roof overhead, you can sense how oppressive winter would have been, how trapped, how cold, how desperate the wait for spring. Juvenal, the Roman satirist, documented these conditions with bitter precision. He wrote about buildings collapsing, about fires racing through insulae before anyone could escape, about rent that consumed most of a worker's income for rooms that barely qualified as shelter. His accounts weren't exaggeration, they were observation. Archaeological evidence confirms what he described: burn marks on walls, structural collapses, evidence of overcrowding so severe that it defied safety and sanity both. Yet people adapted because they had to. Ground floor residents benefited from commercial heat below. They paid more for that privilege, but it was worth it when winter arrived. Middle floors developed their own hierarchies. Rooms facing south caught more sun. Rooms on interior walls shared heat with neighbours. Corner rooms were coldest and cheapest. Top floor residents, the poorest of the poor, lived in spaces that were barely habitable. Some landlords didn't bother repairing roofs up there. Why invest in improvements when tenants had no choice but to stay or become homeless? But survival happened anyway, not through architecture. The buildings themselves offered almost nothing, not through wealth. These were people who couldn't afford better. Survival happened through ingenuity, through traditions passed between generations, through folk knowledge about bodies and warmth and endurance that most Romans learned before they learned to read. The insulae were structures of deprivation, yes, but they were also laboratories of adaptation. In rooms where technology failed and comfort was impossible, humans found other ways that didn't depend on furnaces or fuel or anything that could be bought. Ways that required nothing except understanding, cooperation, and the willingness to endure what couldn't be changed. Those ways, those secrets of survival without resources, that's where the real story lives. Romans didn't have polyester. They didn't have synthetic down or electric blankets or memory foam designed in laboratories. What they had were sheep, flax plants, animal hides, and 2,000 years of accumulated knowledge about how natural materials behave when winter arrives. That knowledge, empirical, tested across generations, refined through trial and fatal error, made the difference between sleep and hypothermia, between surviving until spring and becoming another winter statistic. Start with the bed itself. The wealthy slept on lectus, wooden frames raised off cold floors, strung with rope or leather strips that created a flexible sleeping surface. This elevation mattered more than comfort. Cold air settles. Sleeping even a foot above the floor meant sleeping in warmer air. On top of this frame went layers. First a torus, a mattress stuffed with wool if you could afford quality, or plant materials like dried grass and reeds if you couldn't. Then a colcita, a thicker mattress or cushion, adding more insulation between body and frame. The wealthy used feathers, which trapped air beautifully and created warmth with minimal weight. But feathers were expensive, requiring geese or other birds in quantities that only the prosperous could access. Textiles layered on top followed seasonal logic. Summer meant linen, woven from flax, breathable, cool against skin when heat became the enemy instead of the ally. But winter transformed the bed completely. Linen disappeared, replaced by wool. Not just any wool, but specific types Romans knew by region and reputation. Wool from Tarentum in southern Italy was prized for softness. Wool from Gaul was coarser, but durable. Miletus in Asia Minor produced wool that wealthy Romans sought specifically for winter bedding. They understood what modern science confirms. Wool's structure traps air in thousands of tiny pockets, creating insulation that works even when damp. Wool can absorb moisture up to 30% of its weight without feeling wet, without losing its warming properties. For people living in cold, damp conditions without waterproofing, this was survival technology woven into fibre. The blankets themselves, lodices, came in weights and qualities that mapped directly onto social hierarchy. A wealthy household might have multiple heavy wool blankets layered for adjustable warmth. For the truly elite, furs arrived from northern territories, bear, wolf, fox, even exotic pelts from beyond the empire's borders. These weren't just luxury. fur insulates remarkably well, and Romans understood that animal skin with hair intact created warmth that woven fabric couldn't match. Some evidence suggests they used skins as primitive sleeping bags, wrapping themselves completely, creating micro-environments where body heat accumulated instead of escaping into cold rooms. But most Romans couldn't afford fur or premium wool. They slept on straw pallets laid directly on floors, thin mattresses stuffed with whatever plant material was available, dried grass that compressed and lost insulation over time, reeds that poked through fabric, materials that needed constant replacement. Their blankets were threadbare, patched, inherited, shared among families who owned perhaps one or two between them. Wool that had been woven, worn, repaired, worn again until the fibers barely held together. Yet even these degraded textiles provided some protection, some barrier between flesh and cold that made survival possible. For the enslaved, conditions stripped away even these minimal comforts. Many slept on bare floors, on rough wooden benches, in storage rooms and outbuildings never designed for human habitation. Their covering might be a single worn cloak, a piece of sacking, or nothing at all beyond the clothes they wore during the day. Masters calculated their investments. Keeping slaves alive required minimum provisions, but comfort was expense without return. The cruelty was economic as much as personal. Romans knew details modern people have forgotten. They understood that keeping the head covered mattered enormously. More heat escapes through an uncovered head than through most other body parts. Evidence suggests they slept in wool caps or wrapped cloth around their heads, preserving warmth that would otherwise radiate into darkness. They knew to sleep in their day clothes during the coldest nights, adding layers instead of removing them, using everything they owned simultaneously when temperature demanded it. Bedding appeared in wills, in property inventories, in legal documents as items of real value. The number of blankets someone owned was a status marker, a measure of wealth as real as silver or land. Families passed textiles down through generations, repairing them endlessly because replacement was expensive or impossible. A good wool blanket represented weeks of labour, shearing, cleaning, carding, spinning, weaving, and its value reflected that investment. Yet even with the best materials, with elevated beds and layered wool and covered heads, physical barriers alone weren't sufficient. Romans understood something modern centrally heated life has made us forget, that survival required more than just possessions. It required behaviour, technique, wisdom about bodies and warmth and the long hours between dusk and dawn. The materials were tools, but tools require skill to use effectively. And those skills, those practices, those intimate understandings of how humans generate and preserve heat, that's where the deepest knowledge lived. Darkness falls over Rome and a familiar prepares for sleep. Not individuals retreating to private rooms, but a household arranging itself like pieces of a puzzle, each body positioned with purpose. Parents in the centre, children tucked between them where warmth concentrates. Older siblings on the edges, their larger bodies creating barriers against the cold radiating from walls. In the servants' quarters, enslaved workers huddled close on shared pallets, no space wasted, every gap eliminated. This isn't accidental. This is strategy refined over centuries, knowledge encoded in practice rather than writing, the understanding that human bodies are furnaces, and furnaces work better together. A single person generates roughly the same heat as a 100-watt light bulb, about 350 kilojoules per hour. That heat dissipates quickly in a cold room, lost to air and stone that absorb it without effect. But put multiple people together, reduce the space between them, and suddenly that heat accumulates instead of escaping. The air temperature in an enclosed room can rise several degrees just from body heat when enough people share it. Add blankets over top, trapping that warmth close, and you create a microclimate, a pocket of survivable temperature inside a building that's barely above freezing. Romans understood this without thermometers or physics. They understood it because they lived it, because the families who figured it out survived, and the ones who didn't left fewer descendants. The knowledge passed parent to child through demonstration, through cold nights where proximity meant the difference between sleep and shivering wakefulness. Children learned young where to position themselves between adults if you were small and cold, on the edges if you were bigger and could handle exposure. Families developed sleeping arrangements as deliberate as any architectural plan, arrangements that shifted with the seasons and adjusted for who was present, who was sick, who needed warmth most desperately. Even the wealthy, who had space enough for privacy, often chose proximity over isolation. Evidence appears in unexpected places, literary references to shared beds, far too casual to be unusual, artistic depictions in frescoes showing multiple figures beneath the same covering, archaeological remnants of beds sized for 3 or 4 bodies rather than one. Some wealthy Romans had enslaved servants sleep at the foot of their beds specifically to provide warmth. The servant's body heat rose through the blankets, warming the master above. It was efficient. It was cruel. It worked. For the poor, proximity wasn't optional. Entire families lived in single rooms too small for modern building codes. Parents and children, sometimes grandparents, sometimes unrelated boarders, all sleeping in the same space because space was what they couldn't afford. Winter made these cramped conditions almost merciful. The crowding they endured year-round became survival advantage when temperature dropped. Bodies that were packed too close in summer became sources of warmth in winter, creating temperatures that made sleep possible in rooms with no other heating. In insulae, neighbours sometimes shared spaces on the coldest nights. Walls between apartments were thin enough that each room's warmth or cold affected adjacent ones. Families that maintained better heat retention created slightly warmer conditions for neighbours through shared walls. Some evidence suggests informal cooperation, families combining into one apartment temporarily, doubling or tripling occupancy to maximise shared warmth, accepting the discomfort of crowding because the alternative was worse. Military barracks perfected this strategy by necessity. 8 soldiers to a contubernium, sharing a single room in winter quarters. They slept close, sometimes in paired bunks, sometimes on floor pallets arranged, so every man touched at least one other. Veterans taught new recruits the system, who slept where, how to arrange bodies to maximise warmth, how to rotate positions so edge sleepers didn't bear the cold all night. This wasn't just comfort. A unit that couldn't sleep couldn't fight. Survival was tactical requirement, and commanders who ignored it weakened their forces more effectively than any enemy. Roman concepts of privacy were simply different. What modern Western culture considers normal, individual bedrooms, personal space, isolation as default, would have seemed bizarre to ancient Romans. Communal sleeping was standard across most of human history, not an aberration. Privacy was luxury, and like all luxuries, it was expensive. Most people couldn't afford it and didn't expect it. They expected company, contact, the press of other humans whose presence was normal and whose warmth was necessary. The practice extended beyond nighttime. Before sleep, families gathered in the warmest areas available, near hearths if they had them, in rooms that captured days' residual heat, in spaces small enough that body heat accumulated. They stayed close during evening activities, sharing warmth before dispersing to sleep. Some households had pre-sleep routines that explicitly involved warming each other, sitting together, physical contact that raised skin temperature, practices that prepared bodies for the colder air they'd endure once blankets went on and fires banked low. This knowledge was biological truth expressed through culture. Humans evolved in climates where fire and proximity were the only defenses against cold. Romans inherited those instincts and refined them through necessity. They didn't need to understand thermodynamics or metabolism. They needed to understand that cold kills alone, but can be survived together, that bodies are resources, that survival is often communal rather than individual. In a civilization celebrated for aqueducts and roads and military precision, perhaps their most effective technology was also their most intimate. The simple, profound decision to sleep close, to share warmth, to recognize that sometimes the most powerful force available is each other. Evening in Rome and the ritual begins. A wealthy citizen leaves his domus wrapped in a heavy cloak, walking through streets already sharp with cold toward the thermae, the public baths that anchor every Roman neighborhood. Inside, he moves through the progression Romans know by heart. The tepidarium first, warm but not shocking, letting his body adjust. Then the caldarium, hot enough that sweat beads immediately, hot water opening pores and flooding muscles with heat that penetrates deep into the body's core. He stays longer than he would in summer, letting the heat soak inward, raising his internal temperature several degrees above normal. Finally, a brief visit to the frigidarium, cold water that closes pores, seals in warmth, before dressing quickly and rushing home while heat still radiates from his skin. By the time he reaches his bed, his body is a furnace. That elevated temperature will carry him through the first hours of night, making cold tolerable, making sleep possible. This wasn't luxury ritual. This was survival technology disguised as civilization, and it wasn't restricted to the wealthy. Public baths charged minimal fees, sometimes just a quadrans, a quarter of an aes, less than the cost of a loaf of bread. Emperors subsidized bath access deliberately, understanding that public health depended on hygiene and warmth both. a population that could bathe stayed healthier through winter, suffered fewer respiratory infections, maintained the physical capacity to work and pay taxes and keep the empire functioning, so baths remained accessible across classes, and Romans of every status used them, especially in winter, especially before sleep. The wisdom behind it was empirical but accurate. Modern physiology confirms what Romans observed. Entering sleep with elevated core temperature improves sleep quality and cold tolerance. Warm water relaxes muscles, reduces the pain of cold-induced tension, promotes the parasympathetic state necessary for deep rest. The body naturally cools during sleep, core temperature dropping as metabolism slows. Starting warmer meant that natural cooling didn't immediately create discomfort. You bought yourself hours of relative comfort, enough to fall asleep before cold became intrusive. But most Romans couldn't visit baths every evening. Distance, cost, time, various barriers kept it from being universal practice. So alternatives emerged, adapted to circumstance and resource. Heating water for foot baths became common among those with access to fuel. Feet are extremities where cold concentrates and where warming them affects whole body temperature perception. A simple basin of warm water before bed could change the entire night's experience. Some families heated bricks or stones near whatever heat source they could access. Communal ovens, a neighbour's hearth, anywhere fire burned. They'd wrap these in cloth, carry them home, place them at the foot of sleeping pallets where residual heat radiated for hours. Dietary practices aligned with the same logic. Romans favoured heavier, fattier foods in winter, not from ignorance but from observation that certain foods seemed to generate more internal warmth. They were right. Fat is calorie-dense and calories are literally units of heat. The body metabolizing food produces warmth as a byproduct, and fatty foods extend that process, creating sustained internal heat generation. A meal rich in olive oil, fatty meat, thick stew, these weren't just satisfying, they were fuel that burned slow and warm through the night. Wine entered the equation too, though Romans understood its complexity. Consumed in moderation with food, wine created sensation of warmth through vasodilation, blood vessels expanding, bringing warm blood to skin surface. That sensation was real, even if the actual heat loss from increased surface blood flow meant the net effect was complicated. But perception mattered. Feeling warm helped people sleep, and sleep itself was survival necessity. Romans typically diluted their wine, drinking it mixed with water and sometimes warmed with honey and spices. Molsum, honey wine, was winter comfort and practical heat in one cup. Roman physicians codified these practices into medical advice. Galen recommended specific pre-sleep routines for winter health, moderate evening exercise to generate warmth without sweat, warm beverages, heavy meals timed to allow digestion before lying down. Other medical texts mention warming herbs, ginger, pepper, certain roots believed to heat the body from within. Whether these worked pharmacologically or through placebo, they were part of the arsenal, techniques people deployed because experience suggested benefit. Wealth created variations in execution, but not in principle. Rich Romans had enslaved workers heat stones for their beds, prepare spiced wine, warm rooms before they entered. Poor Romans did what they could with what they had, ate extra food if they had it, drank warm water if they could heat it, wrapped themselves in whatever held heat. But the underlying knowledge was shared. Preparation mattered. Entering sleep warm was advantage. The body needed fuel and heat to endure cold hours. There was psychological dimension too. Rituals create sense of control. In a world where so much was unpredictable and dangerous, where winter could kill and did, having routines, things you did every night that helped, that worked, that your parents taught you and their parents taught them, provided comfort beyond just physical warmth. These practices said, we know how to survive this, we have done it before, we will do it again. That psychological resilience, that confidence built through repeated successful winters, was itself a survival tool. Roman winter survival was never just one thing, it was architecture and materials and proximity and ritual, layered together into systems that addressed body and mind simultaneously. They understood something modern climate-controlled life lets us forget, that thriving in cold requires active participation, that bodies need preparation, that sleep is not passive, but something you ready yourself for. Their rituals were wisdom compressed into practice, knowledge that didn't need scientific explanation to work, that modern research increasingly validates. They knew how to warm themselves from within, how to enter darkness with advantage, how to give their bodies the best chance at rest despite cold that never stopped pressing against walls, seeking entry, testing their defenses through every hour until dawn. Night in ancient Rome wasn't the abbreviated darkness modern cities experience. It was vast, consuming, lasting 14 hours or more in deep winter. No streetlights, no device screens, just oil lamps that most families couldn't afford to burn all night, and darkness so complete that movement meant navigating by memory and touch. In this darkness, Romans slept differently than we do, not in one continuous block but in phases. Primo somno, the first sleep, began shortly after sunset. Then, hours later, wakefulness. Not insomnia, not disturbance, but expected interval when you rose in darkness, tended to needs, adjusted your bedding, checked on children, perhaps added fuel to a dying brazier if you had one. Then post-meridianus somnus, the second sleep, carrying you toward dawn. This pattern wasn't dysfunction, it was how humans slept for most of history, before artificial light convinced us that 8 consecutive hours was normal. For winter survival, this segmented sleep was advantage. The wakeful period allowed adjustments that continuous sleep couldn't accommodate. Bodies shifted, seeking warmth. Blankets were repositioned where they'd slipped. Children who'd kicked off coverings were rewrapped. If you were cold, genuinely cold, you could address it, move closer to others, add another layer, redistribute blankets, without fighting through sleep inertia. The body's awareness during this natural waking meant you could respond to cold before it became dangerous, before it pulled you into shivering wakefulness that wouldn't allow return to rest. Sleeping positions mattered enormously. Romans understood what physiology confirms. Curled positions conserve heat better than sprawled ones. The fetal position minimizes surface area exposed to cold air, protecting the torso where vital organs generate and require the most warmth. Families arranged themselves strategically, larger bodies on the outside, creating windbreaks for smaller ones, children in the center, where multiple adults' heat converged, the elderly, whose bodies generated less warmth, positioned where others' heat reached them. This wasn't random arrangement, this was practiced choreography, each person knowing their place in the thermal geometry of survival. Heads stayed covered. Archaeological evidence and artistic depictions both suggest Romans frequently slept with cloth wrapped around their heads or with wool caps pulled low. Modern science explains why up to 40% of body heat can escape through an uncovered head. Romans didn't know the percentage, but they knew the reality. Covered heads meant warmer bodies, and warmer bodies meant better sleep. Extremities received similar attention, hands drawn inside sleeves or tucked under bodies, feet wrapped in cloth, never exposed. Cold extremities don't just feel uncomfortable, they signal the body to constrict blood flow, reducing core temperature, triggering shivering that disrupts rest. Keep extremities warm, and the whole system functions better. Romans often slept clothed, not naked as modern comfort suggests. Day tunics stayed on. In coldest weather, additional layers went on at bedtime rather than coming off. This violated no social norm. It was practical recognition that fabric against skin provided insulation blankets alone couldn't match, that layering worked as well at night as during the day. Some sources suggest sleeping in wool specifically, the material's properties making it ideal for maintaining warmth through hours of immobility. Managing the night's necessities required strategy. Chamber pots stayed within reach because leaving warm sleeping areas to urinate outside meant exposing yourself to cold that could take an hour to recover from. You'd return chilled, struggle to warm again, possibly wake others in the process. Better to have vessels close, to minimize exposure, to preserve the warmth you'd built. Repositioning without waking others was skill, knowing how to shift weight, adjust position, reclaim comfort without disturbing the carefully arranged human architecture around you. In communal arrangements, social agreements governed warmth distribution. Edge positions were colder, exposed to room air and wall chill. Interior positions were warmer, insulated by bodies on multiple sides. Fairness suggested rotation, taking turns in colder spots so no one bore disproportionate hardship. Evidence suggests some households did exactly this, particularly among equals. But hierarchy intruded too. Masters in centre, slaves at edges. Parents in warmth, older children as buffers. Rank had temperature privileges. Roman philosophy shaped how they framed all this. Stoicism, deeply influential across social classes, taught that external circumstances, including cold, were indifference. What mattered was virtue, was attitude, was mental discipline in the face of discomfort. This wasn't empty rationalization, it was psychological technology that made endurance possible. If you framed cold as test of character rather than merely as suffering, you created meaning that helped you persist. Military training deliberately cultivated this mindset, exposing soldiers to cold, building tolerance and mental toughness simultaneously. The culture celebrated endurance, created stories about toughness, rewarded those who bore hardship without complaint. This cultural framework didn't make cold comfortable, but it made it bearable, gave it context, turned survival into achievement. Yet even with all these strategies, Roman winter sleep wasn't the deep, uninterrupted rest modern comfort creates. It was lighter, more fragmented, punctuated by awareness of cold, by small adjustments, by the body's constant negotiation with temperature. Their sleep architecture adapted to this reality. They woke more easily, returned to sleep more readily, functioned on rest patterns that modern people might consider insufficient. But their bodies and minds had calibrated to these conditions. They didn't expect 8 uninterrupted hours in perfect comfort. They expected to work for sleep, to maintain it actively, to treat night as something requiring participation rather than passive unconsciousness. In the darkest hours, under wool that was never quite enough, they practiced an art of rest we've completely forgotten, not fighting wakefulness but incorporating it, not seeking perfect comfort but managing tolerable discomfort, not sleeping through the night but sleeping with it, dancing with cold in darkness until dawn broke and warmth could begin again. Evening settles over a modest Roman home and a bronze brazier comes to life. Someone has filled it with charcoal. Good charcoal, the kind that glows steady and hot, without the smoke and spark that cheaper fuel produces. The metal vessel sits on 3 legs, raising it slightly off the floor, heat radiating outward in waves you can feel from across the room. The family gathers close, not just for warmth but for light, because the coals provide both, turning the brazier into the functional heart of the household as darkness claims the world outside. This is the foculus, sometimes called bratium, Rome's portable fire, a technology so simple it barely registers as technology at all, yet so essential that homes without one faced winter at severe disadvantage. Braziers came in varieties that mapped directly onto wealth and status. The poor used clay or simple ceramic vessels, functional but fragile, prone to cracking under repeated heating. Middle-class families invested in bronze or iron, durable metals that conducted heat efficiently and lasted for years if maintained properly. The wealthy commissioned elaborate braziers, sometimes silver, decorated with figured reliefs or ornamental legs, objects that announced status even as they performed the humble work of warming rooms. But regardless of material, the principle remained constant, a metal container that held burning fuel safely, concentrating heat, making fire portable in ways that fixed hearths could never match. Portability was the critical advantage. A brazier could move through a house following need, placed in the triclinium during evening meals, carried to sleeping chambers before bed, positioned near doorways to warm incoming drafts. This flexibility meant families with single braziers could strategically deploy warmth rather than losing it to empty rooms. Before sleep, the brazier entered the bedroom, warming air and stone walls for an hour or more, raising the ambient temperature enough that sleep became comfortable. Then, depending on resources and risk tolerance, it either stayed, carefully monitored, fuel-controlled to prevent flare-ups, or was removed to another space, its residual warmth carrying through the first hours of night. Fuel choice revealed both knowledge and economics. Charcoal was ideal, wood that had been burned in low oxygen conditions, converting it to nearly pure carbon. Charcoal burned hotter and cleaner than wood, producing minimal smoke and steady heat, perfect for enclosed spaces. But producing charcoal required labour, specialised kilns and time, making it expensive. Wealthy households burned charcoal exclusively. Poor families used what they could afford: wood chips, olive pits after oil pressing, even dried dung in desperate circumstances. These alternatives worked but produced more smoke, required more frequent feeding, created ash and spark that charcoal avoided. The fuel you burned announced your economic status as clearly as the brazier itself. Romans learned practical knowledge through experience that sometimes killed those who learned too slowly. They understood ventilation mattered, that rooms sealed too tightly with burning braziers became dangerous in ways that weren't immediately obvious. What they called fumes we now know as carbon monoxide, odorless and invisible, produced when carbon burns in insufficient oxygen. The symptoms, headache, dizziness, confusion, eventual unconsciousness and death, were documented in Roman medical texts without understanding the mechanism. They knew sealed rooms and smouldering fires created danger. They knew to maintain some air circulation, to crack shutters even in coldest weather if a brazier burned inside. This knowledge saved lives, even if the chemistry behind it remained mysterious. Class divided brazier use as it divided everything else. Wealthy Romans employed enslaved workers specifically to manage heating, tending braziers through the night, adding fuel in careful amounts, monitoring for problems, ensuring warmth remained constant without becoming dangerous. These workers bore the risks of proximity to fire and fumes, while masters slept in comfort their labour maintained. Common Romans had no such assistance. They managed braziers themselves, balancing the need for warmth against the exhaustion of night watch, against the dangers of falling asleep with active flame, against regulations that often forbade such devices entirely in the structures where they lived. Insulae implemented fire codes born from catastrophic experience. Upper floors, constructed with wood frames and packed with combustible materials, were tinderboxes where single accidents could kill hundreds. Many buildings banned braziers in these apartments entirely, imposing fines or eviction on violators. Residents faced impossible choices: obey the law and freeze, or break it and risk both eviction and the fires that regulations existed to prevent. Some took the risk, hiding braziers, using them only when desperate, living with the knowledge that warmth came at the cost of multiple forms of danger. Archaeological evidence preserves the reality of brazier use across the empire. Pompeii and Herculaneum, frozen by volcanic catastrophe, contain braziers still positioned where they were being used in 79 CE. Some retain ancient charcoal, 2,000-year-old fuel, waiting for flames that will never come. Floors show scorch marks, circles of discoloration where braziers sat repeatedly, heat slowly changing the stone or tile beneath. Artistic depictions in frescoes and mosaics show braziers integrated into domestic scenes. Families gathered around them, servants carrying them between rooms, braziers present at dinners and gatherings as assumed elements of civilized living. Yet every brazier contained paradox. The same device that provided essential warmth could destroy everything around it, tip it over and embers scattered, catching fabric, igniting furniture, spreading fire faster than people could respond. Let it burn too long in a sealed room and invisible fumes accumulated, killing without warning. The warmth was real. The danger was equally real. Roman ingenuity appeared not in eliminating this tension but in managing it, developing practices, knowledge and strategies that let them capture fire's benefits while minimizing its catastrophic potential. They succeeded more often than they failed, or there would be no empire to study. But the failures left marks in the historical record. Seneca's descriptions of fires consuming entire blocks, Martial's dark humor about tenement blazes, legal codes that grew stricter with each disaster. Romans lived with risks modern people have largely eliminated, and they developed sophisticated understanding of those risks. Not eliminating danger, because that was impossible with available technology, but calibrating it, accepting calculated risk, because the alternative was worse. In the glowing coals of a bronze brazier, they found warmth enough to survive winter. And in managing that fire through thousands of dark nights, they demonstrated a relationship with danger that modern safety has made us forget. The knowledge that comfort sometimes requires risk, that survival means living with threats you understand but cannot eliminate, that fire serves best when respected for both what it gives and what it can take away. The Roman hearth was never just fire-contained, it was the axis around which the household turned, both physically and spiritually. They called it the focus, and the word itself reveals its centrality. To focus meant to gather around the hearth, to be oriented toward it, to find direction in its presence. This was where household gods, the lares, received offerings and protection, where family identity lived in continuous flame, where sacred obligation met survival necessity so completely that Romans couldn't imagine separating them. The fire that warmed also sanctified. The smoke that carried heat skyward also carried prayers. In the hearth, the practical and the divine merged into single reality. Early Roman hearths were elemental, fire pits set into floors surrounded by stone to contain heat and ember, with openings in the roof above allowing smoke to escape. No complex engineering, just recognition that fire needed containment and combustion needed air. Over centuries, designs evolved. Raised platforms lifted flames off cold floors, improving draft and heat radiation. Some wealthy homes incorporated rudimentary chimneys, not the tall brick structures we imagine, but channels that directed smoke more efficiently than simple roof holes. Yet chimneys remained rare, expensive, architecturally complex in ways that most builders couldn't or wouldn't attempt. Most hearths relied on the ancient method: fire below, smoke rising, holes above. Placement mattered enormously. In older homes, hearths occupied the atrium, the central hall where sunlight entered and family life concentrated. As Roman architecture evolved, hearths migrated to the cullina, the kitchen, where cooking and heating merged into single function. But wherever they sat, hearths determined how the rest of the house organized itself. Rooms nearest the hearth were warmest, most desirable. Architectural layouts reflected this thermal reality, living spaces positioned to capture residual heat, sleeping areas arranged to benefit from warmed walls, entire floor plans oriented around the physics of heat distribution. The hearth's daily rhythm shaped household life. Morning began with reviving banked coals, bringing yesterday's fire back to active flame, easier than starting fresh, which required friction, tinder, patience and labour that nobody wanted to repeat daily. Through the day, the hearth served cooking needs, boiling water, baking bread, heating whatever required heat. This constant use generated warmth that radiated into adjacent spaces, warming stone floors and walls that would hold that heat for hours. By evening, when cooking finished, the hearth became social centre. Families gathered near it, drawn by warmth and light, spending final waking hours in the thermal envelope it created before dispersing to colder sleeping areas. Wealth determined hearth quantity and quality. Prosperous homes might have multiple hearths, one in the kitchen, another in a dining room, perhaps one in a private chamber. This redundancy meant warmth could be distributed, rooms could be heated independently, households could function even if one hearth failed. Poor families often had no personal hearth at all, relying on communal ovens in neighbourhoods or going without entirely, their cooking and heating needs unmet by architecture that provided almost nothing. Pompeii and Herculaneum preserve hearths in states of arrested function. You can see char patterns on surrounding stone, darker where heat concentrated, lighter where it dispersed. Pot hooks still hang from chains, positioned to suspend cooking vessels over flame. Some hearths contain heating stones, rocks placed in fire then transferred to other uses, carrying heat where flames couldn't go. Architectural layouts show how rooms clustered around these thermal centres, doorways positioned to allow heat circulation, furniture arrangements oriented toward warmth. Artistic depictions show families at hearths, children close, adults working, the fire as assumed backdrop to domestic existence. Romans developed sophisticated hearth management. Banking coals at night meant covering active embers with ash, reducing oxygen supply enough to slow burning without extinguishing flame entirely. Morning required only removing ash and adding fuel. The fire never fully died. This practice conserved labour and resources, maintaining continuity that had spiritual dimension too. A hearth that never went cold represented family continuity, ancestors' presence, life persisting through generations. Letting the hearth die completely was avoided when possible, seen as inauspicious, a break in the thread connecting past to present. They understood fuel differentiation. Oak burned long and hot, but took time to catch. Pine ignited easily, but burned fast. Different woods for different purposes, knowledge passed from parent to child through demonstration rather than instruction. Ash could insulate, piled around the hearth's base to retain heat in surrounding stone. Smoke told stories. Thick and dark meant poor fuel or insufficient air. Thin and transparent meant good combustion. Acrid smell meant something wrong. Yet efficiency had limits. Most heat rose and escaped through smoke holes or poorly insulated roofs. The immediate area around a hearth was warm, sometimes almost too warm, but that warmth dissipated rapidly with distance. Back corners of rooms remained cold. Sleeping chambers distant from the hearth barely benefited, and fuel costs were constant burden. Gathering or purchasing wood, storing it dry, managing supply through winter when demand peaked and availability often declined. Still, the hearth endured as concept and practice because it served multiple irreplaceable functions simultaneously. Warmth, cooking, light, social centre, sacred space, all concentrated in single architectural element. Where smoke rose to honour gods who protected the household, warmth descended to keep that household alive through winter. The Roman hearth was where survival and meaning became inseparable, where the most practical necessity transformed into spiritual obligation, where tending fire meant maintaining family, where coals glowing in darkness connected one generation to every generation before it and promised continuation to all that would follow. In Rome, fire was both blessing and threat, a glow that fed the city and a hunger that could swallow it. The Great Fire of 64 CE still lingers like a bruise of heat. Nights turned bright as noon, roofs collapsing in showers of sparks, whole quarters becoming a wind-driven furnace. It tore through markets and homes, left hundreds of thousands without shelter, and killed countless people whose names were never written down. Families ran with bundles on their backs, then watched from the hills as their street turned into a river of sparks. That famous catastrophe was not a strange exception. It was the daily danger of Rome, made enormous and impossible to ignore. Rome was built to burn. The poorest lived in tall insula, apartment blocks raised quickly and cheaply, with wooden frames, thin partitions, and stairways that behaved like chimneys. Shops and homes shared walls, and the lanes between them were narrow enough to trap heat and funnel gusts. Oil, cloth, timber and pitch were ordinary goods, stored close to sleeping rooms. Open flames cooked meals, heated water and warmed hands. With so many little fires in so little space, one careless moment could become a neighbourhood alarm. The danger was intimate, tied to sleep itself. Braziers meant to keep a room livable could tip when a sleeper turned. Embers could roll from a hearth onto a dry floor, then creep under bedding like a patient animal. An oil lamp, knocked by a careless elbow, could spill and spread a bright running fire. The deadliest moment was often the calmest, the instant someone drifted off while the heat source still breathed. Every Roman who closed their eyes beside a brazier's glow knew the terrible truth. The warmth keeping them alive could become the fire consuming them before dawn. The empire tried to answer that truth with organization. Augustus created the vigiles, men who patrolled after dark, watching for smoke and listening for the first crackle. They carried buckets and hand pumps, axes and hooks, and tools for tearing down structures when water could not win. Sometimes they formed chains to pass water from fountains. Sometimes they smashed walls to make gaps the flames could not leap. Yet their victories were limited. If a fire took hold inside an insula, it usually ate the whole building and then spread along shared walls to the next. Rules multiplied like soot. Certain heating methods were forbidden in cramped blocks, clear space around flames was required, and penalties waited for landlords and tenants who ignored hazards. But winter pressed harder than any notice on a wall. A parent shivering beside a child could read the law and still strike a spark. People banked coals under ash, set braziers on bricks, hung cloth higher, and kept water close by, as if small habits could bargain with chance. Some endured the cold rather than risk it. Others accepted the gamble as the cost of warmth. Writers recorded what happened when habits failed. Seneca describes families lost in the night, overcome before they could rise. Juvenal warns that the poor man high in an insula is the last to hear and the last to escape, if escape is possible at all. Archaeology adds its own quiet testimony. Burned rooms, collapsed beams, and human remains found where sleep ended without a shout. After a blaze, fear did not end with the smoke. Charred streets filled with the displaced, and winter turned homelessness into a second danger. Without shelter, exposure stalked the old, the young and the sick, and the city's help was limited. And so the choice returned, again and again, to every household: freeze slowly and certainly, or risk burning suddenly and catastrophically. Rome endured because there were no alternatives to fire, only smarter ways to live beside it. Beyond the city walls, Roman soldiers would face the same bargain in harsher winters on frontiers. At the empire's frozen edges, Roman engineers built more than forts. They constructed elaborate machines for turning stone and discipline into survival. Picture Hadrian's Wall in the dead of a Britannic winter. 73 miles of stone stretching across the narrowest part of the province, and every 100 yards, a mile castle sheltering men who faced an enemy more relentless than any barbarian tribe: the cold itself. Wind screaming off the North Sea, temperatures plunging below freezing for months, snowdrifts that could bury a man. This wasn't garrison duty, this was survival architecture. Roman military barracks weren't improvised shelters. They were carefully engineered responses to a brutal equation: keep soldiers alive and combat ready through winters that could kill an unprepared man in hours. Walk through the ruins at Vindolanda, Housesteads, or any frontier fort, and you're looking at the fossilized remains of strategic thinking made manifest in stone. The basic unit was the centuriae, rectangular stone buildings housing a century of men, but the genius lay in the details. Rooms were deliberately small, sized for 8 soldiers in a contubernium, the fundamental Roman military unit. This wasn't about comfort, it was thermodynamics. 8 men in a confined space generated enough body heat to raise temperatures 10-15 degrees above the murderous cold outside. Windows were minimal, tiny openings that could be shuttered tight with wood or hide, blocking wind that would steal precious warmth. The walls themselves told a story of calculated protection. 2 feet thick in many installations constructed from local stone with rubble cores. They provided insulation that wood or packed earth could never match. Tile roofs, expensive and labour-intensive, proved superior to thatch or wooden shingles. They didn't retain moisture, didn't rot, didn't collapse under snow loads. Some forts employed raised floors with air channels beneath, preventing the ground dampness that claimed more lives than freezing temperatures. Wet cold kills faster than dry cold. Roman engineers understood this empirically. Archaeological evidence reveals that elite positions received extraordinary solutions. Along the Rhine and Danube frontiers, excavations show hypercourse systems, underfloor heating in officer quarters and sometimes troop barracks. Hot air from furnaces circulated beneath raised floors, radiating warmth upward. The fuel costs were enormous, the construction complex, but for strategic positions, the Romans considered it worthwhile investment. Fortress design created artificial microclimates. Interior courtyards provided wind-sheltered spaces where soldiers could move between buildings without exposure. Kitchen blocks and bath complexes were strategically positioned to radiate heat to adjacent living quarters. In some installations, entire barracks complexes were enclosed within inner walls, creating temperature-controlled environments degrees warmer than the brutal exterior. The written evidence from Vindolanda brings human reality to architectural remains. Thin wooden tablets preserved in anaerobic mud reveal soldiers' voices across 2 millennia. Requests for warm socks and underwear, complaints about inadequate heating, inventories of winter supplies. One letter mentions soldiers suffering from cold, a commander's clinical assessment of men slowly freezing despite every architectural advantage. Because architecture alone couldn't win this war, Roman military logistics included systematic winter provisioning, extra food rations for cold weather caloric demands, charcoal and wood fuel allocations, wool clothing, and leather goods distributed before winter closed roads. This wasn't improvisation, it was bureaucratic machinery grinding forward on supply schedules drafted in Rome and executed across thousands of miles. Different frontiers demanded different solutions. Rhine forts faced Atlantic weather systems, wet, wind-driven cold requiring maximum drainage and moisture control. Danube installations dealt with continental extremes, savage temperature swings demanding both heating and ventilation strategies. Syrian desert outposts faced a different challenge, freezing nights after scorching days, requiring architecture that could moderate both extremes. The sophistication reveals a fundamental truth. Roman military dominance didn't rest solely on tactics, weapons, or training. It depended on keeping soldiers alive through winter. An army that spent 3 months huddled in inadequate shelter, depleted by frostbite and pneumonia, couldn't hold frontiers when spring came. Roman engineers understood this. Every barrel vault, every hypocourse channel, every carefully oriented barracks building represented strategic calculation, transforming hostile climate into survivable conditions through nothing more than stone, planning, and systematic effort. The ruins remain, silent witnesses to an empire that understood a basic military truth. Before you can conquer, you must survive. Every thread, every hide, every calculated layer, Roman soldiers wore not just clothing, but a textile fortress between flesh and frozen death. The breakthrough came from mud. At Vindolanda, just south of Hadrian's Wall, anaerobic soil preserved what normally rots away. Thin wooden tablets inscribed with ink, letters written by soldiers to friends and family 2,000 years ago. Among requisition lists and duty rosters, one message changed how we understand Roman military life. A soldier requesting his commander send warm underwear and socks, not swords, not armor, socks. That single request demolished the myth of the stoic Roman soldier in standardized kit, indifferent to weather. These men were freezing, and they knew exactly what they needed. The basic layer was the tunica, a knee-length wool tunic worn year-round. But winter transformed a soldier's silhouette. Archaeological evidence and artistic depictions show the transformation. A second tunic underneath, sometimes a third. The heavy sagum, a rectangular wool cloak fastened at the shoulder, or the hooded pennula, a rain-resistant cloak with waterproofed wool or leather. For extreme conditions, animal skins, sheepskin, goatskin, even bearskin for officers who could afford it. Roman military thinking understood what modern outdoorsmen rediscovered. Layering works better than bulk. Multiple thin layers trap air, creating insulating pockets that retain body heat while allowing moisture to escape. A man in 3 tunics and a cloak stayed warmer than a man in 1 heavy garment, and he could adjust his protection by removing or adding layers as exertion varied. The sleeping kit reveals obsessive attention to detail. Every soldier carried a personal blanket, the stragulum, part of standard gear like his gladius and shield. In winter postings, this was supplemented with additional blankets or animal skins. Leather tent sections, carried by each 8-man contubernium, formed weatherproof shelters that blocked wind and held heat from the men inside. Excavations show stakes, guy ropes, even evidence of grass or brush flooring materials that provided insulation from frozen ground. Footwear evolved to match conditions. The standard caligae, hobnailed sandal boots perfect for marching in Mediterranean climates, proved inadequate for northern winters. Archaeological finds reveal modifications. Extra leather layers inside, fur lining added to uppers, wool wrappings around feet and calves like primitive socks. Some sites show evidence of completely different winter footwear, enclosed boots more suited to snow and ice. Hands and faces required special protection. Sentries spending hours motionless in freezing temperatures couldn't afford frostbite that would cripple their sword grip. Evidence suggests mittens or fingerless gloves for guards, allowing weapon manipulation while protecting extremities. Textile fragments indicate balaclava-like head coverings that protected faces from wind, essential for men standing watch on exposed walls. The supply system supported this textile fortress. Regular provision of olive oil served dual purposes. Rubbed into leather, it maintained waterproofing and prevented cracking. Applied to skin, it protected against chapping and frostbite. Wool allocations allowed soldiers to darn and repair clothing. A skill veteran soldiers taught recruits as essential as sword drill. Supplementary wine and grain rations during winter months provided the extra calories men needed to generate body heat. These weren't individual survival efforts. The contubernium system meant 8 men shared maintenance responsibilities, pooling knowledge and resources. Veterans showed newcomers how to prepare gear before winter, how to layer effectively, how to recognize frostbite symptoms. This informal education complemented official military training, creating institutional knowledge that passed from generation to generation of soldiers. Evidence from across the empire reveals regional adaptations. Egyptian garrisons preserved textiles showing that even in desert climates, night temperatures demanded warm gear. German frontier forts yielded leather fragments revealing sophisticated tailoring and construction techniques. Monuments from Syria to Scotland depict soldiers in seasonal variations of standard uniforms, visual confirmation of written and archaeological evidence. The genius lay in systematization. When Rhine legions developed an effective cold-weather boot modification, standardized military logistics could spread the innovation to Danube or Britannic units within a campaigning season. The army became a laboratory for cold-weather survival, and successful techniques sometimes filtered into civilian life. Military veterans brought their knowledge home, but equipment alone wasn't enough. Roman soldiers received training in gear maintenance, proper layering techniques, cold-weather survival as part of their military education. A well-equipped soldier who didn't know how to use his gear properly was as vulnerable as an unprepared one. The archaeological record preserves the material culture. The letters preserve the human need. Together, they reveal men who understood survival in hostile climates required more than courage. It demanded knowledge, preparation, and constant attention to the practical details that kept flesh warm and functioning when winter turned frontier duty into a battle against the elements themselves. In the coldest nights, when stone walls and wool blankets failed, Roman soldiers had one final defense, the sacred promise that no brother would freeze alone. Picture a barracks room at House Stead's fort, 2 hours past sunset on a January night. 8 men of a contubernium prepare for sleep with practiced coordination. No wasted movement, no discussion needed. The newest recruit spreads his blanket in the center position, warmest spot reserved for the man who needs it most. 2 veterans take the outer edges where cold seeps through stone. A third checks the shutter fastenings while another stirs the brazier embers. This isn't random. This is choreography learned through winters that killed men who slept alone. The contubernium was Rome's foundational military unit, 8 soldiers who shared a tent on campaign, a barracks room in winter quarters, labor details, rations, and ultimately, survival itself. They weren't just squad mates, they were brothers in a bond deeper than blood, forged by the knowledge that your life depended on 7 other men, and theirs on you. The sleeping arrangements told the story. Positions rotated on a schedule every man understood. Center spots for the coldest or sick, outer positions for the strongest, a constant circulation ensuring no one bore the worst exposure too long. They slept close, body heat combining into a shared warmth that kept the space survivable. This proximity violated peacetime Roman notions of personal space, but winter imposed its own rules. Watch rotations balanced security against survival. A frozen sentry was useless, potentially dead. Units developed systems, shorter watch intervals in extreme cold, double manning so guards could check each other for frostbite symptoms, heated relief areas where men coming off watch could restore circulation before sleeping. These weren't official regulations, they were solutions developed by men who understood the reality of 4-hour watches in sub-zero temperatures. Military correspondence preserved at Vindolanda and other sites reveals the emphasis on collective responsibility. A centurion writes about ensuring his men are properly prepared for winter duties. Another describes veterans teaching newcomers the old soldiers' ways of weathering cold. These weren't just military skills, they were survival knowledge passed down through generations of frontier service. Veterans could read hypothermia in a man's movements, the slight unsteadiness, the slurred speech, the paradoxical removal of clothing as core temperature dropped. They recognized frostbite's early white patches before tissue died, and they knew the remedies: gradual rewarming, not rapid heat that could cause shock. friction massage to restore circulation, warm liquids to raise core temperature, and most importantly, constant monitoring to ensure a weakened man didn't slide into fatal sleep. Resources flowed within the unit based on need, not rank. A soldier whose boots failed got emergency repairs from the contubernium's shared materials. Extra rations went to men recovering from illness. Spare cloaks covered men whose gear was damaged. This wasn't charity, it was recognition that one man's failure threatened the entire unit. Centurions and officers understood that winter survival directly impacted combat readiness. The best commanders conducted pre-winter inspections, not just of official gear, but of the informal preparations their men made. They authorized communal activities, groups weatherproofing barracks with mud and moss, squads collecting extra firewood, foraging parties supplementing official rations with local food sources. Some turned blind eyes to unofficial trading with nearby civilians for extra winter supplies. Unit traditions provided psychological armor against months of darkness and cold. Shared meals became rituals of continuity, the same jokes, the same stories, comforting repetition that said, "We've survived before, we'll survive again." Pre-winter preparations took on ceremonial weight. The day gear was inspected, the first major fuel stockpiling, traditions that marked seasons and gave structure to endless frozen months. The collective commitment created a powerful psychological effect. Men endured not just for themselves, but because 7 others depended on them. That veteran taking out a sleeping position wasn't being heroic, he was fulfilling an unspoken contract that said, "I'll take the hard part today because you took it yesterday, and someone will take it tomorrow." Shared hardship didn't just build morale, it created obligation, and obligation kept men moving when individual willpower failed. Roman military physicians, the most advanced medical practitioners in the ancient world, understood this. Their surviving writings show awareness that winter survival wasn't purely physical. Maintaining unit cohesion, ensuring soldiers felt supported and valued, treating the psychological weight of months-long cold exposure, these were medical concerns alongside frostbite and pneumonia. These practices outlived military service. Veterans carried winter survival knowledge into civilian life. Former soldiers organized collegia, guilds, and associations that maintained military-style mutual support. On frontiers, soldiers and civilians exchanged techniques, military cold weather knowledge flowing into local practices, civilian winter traditions adapted for military use. The archaeological evidence shows equipment and architecture. The written sources preserve regulations and logistics. But the real story lives in the spaces between, in the unwritten knowledge that veterans taught recruits, in the sleeping arrangements no manual prescribed, in the promise that bound 8 men together against the killing cold. Roman soldiers survived winter not because stone walls kept them warm or wool cloaks kept them dry. They survived because they'd learned what humans have always known in the hardest places: we live or die together, and the warmth that matters most doesn't come from fires. Every spoonful of Roman winter stew was more than sustenance, it was liquid fire, carefully crafted to burn within and keep the cold at bay. Romans understood something fundamental about winter survival. The body itself could be a furnace, if properly fueled. This wasn't folk wisdom, it was deliberate strategy rooted in medical theory inherited from Greek traditions. Roman physicians classified foods as inherently heating or cooling, believing that winter demanded a diet weighted toward warming ingredients to balance the body's internal temperature against external cold. The winter table reflected this philosophy. Fatty pork, forbidden or limited in summer diets, became winter staple. Rich game meats, boar, venison, duck, appeared more frequently in cold months. Olive oil consumption increased, drizzled liberally over dishes to add dense calories. Legume stews dominated. Lentils simmered with bacon, chickpeas cooked with aromatics, broad beans mashed with garlic and oil. Porridges thickened from wheat and barley provided cheap, filling warmth for all classes. Modern nutritional science validates Roman instincts. Fatty, calorie-dense foods do help maintain body temperature. They provide the fuel for thermogenesis, the metabolic processes that generate heat. The thermic effect of food, energy your body expends to digest, absorb, and metabolize nutrients, actually warms you from within. Eating itself is a heating activity, and Romans scheduled their consumption accordingly. Class stratified the winter table as it did everything else. Wealthy Romans enjoyed elaborate game preparations described in Apicius's cookbook: wild boar in sweet and sour sauce, roasted hare with cumin, peacock with date compote. They imported exotic spices, black pepper from India, ginger, cinnamon, partly for flavor but also for warming properties medical texts attributed to these ingredients. Wine flowed freely, often warmed with honey and spices in a beverage called conditum. Middle-class tables featured preserved meats, salted pork, smoked sausages, dried fish. Grain-based dishes stretched protein further, barley soup with bacon, wheat porridge enriched with cheese. They could afford wine, though cheaper varieties, and used olive oil generously if they lived in producing regions. Poor Romans subsisted at survival's edge. Pulse, grain porridge, formed the foundation of their diet year-round, but winter demanded whatever protein they could afford: small fish, offal, cheap preserved meats. Posca, a vinegar water beverage, cost almost nothing and provided crucial vitamin C when fresh produce disappeared. Even the poorest Romans had access to garum, fermented fish sauce that added umami richness and protein to bland porridge. Preservation technologies enabled winter nutrition. Romans salted and smoked meats in autumn, creating stores that lasted months. Granaries controlled temperature and moisture, keeping grain viable through winter. Fruits preserved in honey or defrutum, concentrated grape must, provided sweetness and calories. Fermented foods, garum, various pickled vegetables, fish products, delivered nutrients and flavor when fresh options vanished. Meal timing adapted to cold. Romans traditionally ate their main meal, cena, in the afternoon, but winter sometimes prompted an additional evening meal, fuel to generate heat through the long night. Hot food was especially prized: steaming stews, porridges so thick a spoon stood upright, bread fresh from ovens. The heat of consumption mattered as much as the heat of ingredients. Specific winter preparations appear in surviving sources. Cato's agricultural writings detail autumn slaughter and meat preservation. Galen's medical texts prescribe winter diets rich in warming foods: barley, fatty meats, wine. Apicius includes recipes explicitly for cold weather: pork stewed with dried fruit and honey, rich sauces thickened with bread and oil, spiced wine preparations. Spices played an outsized role. Romans imported pepper, ginger, and cinnamon at enormous expense, partly because medical theory held they generated internal heat. Whether this was thermodynamically valid mattered less than belief. The placebo effect has measurable physiological impacts, and Romans convinced they were warming themselves may have actually felt warmer. Communal eating provided dual benefits. Shared meals offered social warmth, psychological comfort against winter's isolation, but preparation and consumption also created physically heated spaces. Braziers for cooking, bodies gathered around tables, steam rising from communal bowls. These transformed dining into temporary refuges from cold. The sophistication lay in systematic approach. Romans didn't just eat more in winter, they deliberately adjusted their diet's composition, favoring ingredients they believed generated internal heat, timing meals to provide nighttime warmth, preserving summer's abundance through technologies that maintained nutrition through months of scarcity. Archaeological evidence supports literary sources. Excavations of Roman kitchens show fuel stores for winter cooking. Bone assemblages reveal seasonal variation in meat consumption. Amphora remains indicate winter wine provisioning. Storage jar residues preserve evidence of preserved fruits, pickled vegetables, fermented products. The winter table wasn't just about preventing starvation. It was about maintaining body temperature through strategic nutrition, about transforming food into fuel that burned from within, about understanding that survival in hostile climates required more than external defenses. It demanded turning the body itself into a heat-generating machine, powered by carefully chosen sustenance. Every meal was a calculated act of thermogenesis, every bite a small rebellion against the killing cold. In every cup of Roman winter wine flowed a contradiction: the warmth that saved lives and the illusion that ended them. Wine was as fundamental to Roman life as bread. Every class drank it daily. Wealthy Romans sipped aged Falernian from crystal cups. Labourers gulped cheap vinegar wine from clay vessels. In many contexts, it was safer than water, and winter intensified dependence. But wine's relationship with cold was treacherous, simultaneously offering genuine comfort and deadly deception. Winter transformed wine service. Romans heated it, creating collider, warm wine mixed with honey, sometimes spiced with cinnamon or pepper, occasionally infused with herbs. The ritual of warming wine created heat beyond the drink itself. Braziers glowing, steam rising, hands wrapped around warm cups. The beverage delivered calories, a flush of perceived warmth spreading through the chest and limbs, and the psychological comfort of a familiar pleasure in harsh months. The physiology, though, told a more complex story. Alcohol triggers vasodilation. Blood vessels near the skin's surface expand, flooding extremities with warmth. You feel warmer because your skin actually is warmer, but this is heat leaving your body's core, radiating into cold air, dropping your internal temperature even as your subjective experience screams warmth. Modern hypothermia deaths often involve alcohol for this exact reason. people feel comfortable while dying. Romans understood this paradox, partially. Medical writers warned against excessive drinking in cold conditions. Galen and other physicians noted that wine could warm or cool depending on quantity and circumstance. Soldiers learned through hard experience that wine before sleep on winter nights could be fatal. Men who felt warm enough to sleep without proper covering woke frozen, if they woke at all. The archaeological and literary record preserves cautionary tales. Accounts of travellers found dead after winter drinking, having misjudged their safety. Stories of sentries who accepted wine against regulations and froze at their posts. Medical case studies describing people who slept outdoors after excessive consumption, their bodies betrayed by false warmth. Context determined outcome. Controlled wine consumption with food provided genuine benefits. The calories mattered. Wine contains about 7 calories per gram of alcohol, energy the body could convert to heat. Shared drinking created social warmth, psychological comfort that aided survival through isolation and darkness. Mild vasodilation could improve circulation in fingers and toes when you were safely indoors and properly clothed, but excess killed. Drunk men passed out in unheated spaces. Impaired judgment led to exposure as people discarded necessary clothing or ventured outdoors inadequately prepared. The same drink that warmed a soldier sharing wine with his contubernium in heated barracks could kill a man who drank alone and fell asleep in the cold. Wine culture itself provided some protection. Romans typically diluted wine with water. Drinking it straight was considered barbaric, something only Germans and other foreigners did. Winter allowed adjustments, less water for more calories and stronger warming effect, but still dilution. Mixing ratios became part of winter survival strategy. Specific winter preparations proliferated. Mulsum, wine sweetened with honey, was especially popular in cold months. Honey added calories and was believed to have its own warming properties. Conditum, elaborate spiced wine resembling modern mulled wine, appeared at winter celebrations and wealthy tables. Medicinal wines incorporated ingredients physicians believed enhanced warming, pepper, ginger, sometimes even more exotic imports. The social function transcended physiology. Wine drinking was communal activity, creating bonds that sustained people through months of hardship. Winter festivals centered on wine. Saturnalia, in December, involved days of feasting and drinking, deliberate excess that provided both physical warmth and psychological relief during the year's darkest stretch. These weren't just celebrations, they were survival strategies disguised as pleasure. The paradox persisted because both sides were real. Wine genuinely helped calories, controlled vasodilation when safely managed, social cohesion, psychological comfort, and wine genuinely killed false warmth, impaired judgment, exposure deaths. Roman winter survival required navigating this knife's edge, understanding that the same beverage could save or destroy depending on context, quantity, and circumstance. In every warm cup lay a wager. Trust wine as ally, but never forget it could betray you the moment you misjudged your safety. Romans who survived winter understood this balance. Those who didn't became warnings preserved in medical texts and cautionary stories, their deaths teaching what explicit instruction couldn't, that in the battle against cold, pleasure could be as dangerous as any enemy. Romans didn't just endure winter cold, they fought it with every step, every task, every deliberate movement that turned muscle into warmth. 2,000 years before scientists mapped cellular respiration and thermogenesis, Romans understood a fundamental truth: motion creates heat. Watch a man shivering and idle beside a man chopping wood. The worker stays warm while the watcher freezes. This observation became survival strategy, woven into daily life with the same deliberation Romans applied to diet and shelter. Winter activity patterns weren't accidental. Before sleep, Romans without access to heating engaged in deliberate movement, pacing rooms, performing simple exercises, physical tasks that raised core temperature. This warmth persisted for hours, the metabolic afterglow of exertion carrying bodies through the coldest part of night. Soldiers in barracks sometimes performed group calisthenics before settling for sleep, collective movement generating shared warmth in spaces that would otherwise drain heat from motionless men. Medical texts formalized what daily life taught. Galen prescribed specific winter exercise regimens: walking, ball games, wrestling, activities that stimulated circulation without inducing dangerous sweating. Military training continued through winter, partly for combat readiness, but experienced commanders understood that drilling troops in the cold served dual purpose. Active soldiers stayed warmer, healthier, more resistant to the respiratory illnesses that devastated inactive garrisons. Class stratified access to warming movement as it did everything else. Wealthy Romans visited the gymnasium or palestra for organized exercise, running, wrestling, ball games in covered courtyards. These weren't just social activities, they were health maintenance, winter survival dressed as leisure. The elaborate bathing ritual included vigorous scraping with the strigil, massage that stimulated circulation, movement through different temperature rooms that challenged and strengthened the body's thermal regulation. Middle-class Romans incorporated warming activities into necessary routines: the walk to market, household repairs, workshop labor. Daily life inherently involved enough movement to maintain heat. They didn't separate exercise from existence. Survival activities and warming strategies were identical. Poor Romans had no choice. Their labor-intensive lives provided constant movement, hauling, building, carrying, manual work that kept muscles generating warmth through the coldest months. For them, stillness wasn't rest. It was the luxury they couldn't afford, the moment when cold crept in and bodies began losing the battle against winter. Timing mattered critically. Romans observed that intense exercise followed by rest in cold conditions invited danger. Sweat-soaked clothing accelerated heat loss. Exhausted bodies couldn't maintain temperature, so they calibrated carefully. Vigorous movement earlier in the day when they could change into dry clothes and recover in warmth. Moderate activity before sleep to raise temperature without inducing sweat. Avoidance of heavy exertion immediately before exposure to cold. This knowledge passed through generations. Elders taught youth when to move and when to rest, how to gauge exertion against temperature, which activities warmed without risking dangerous cooling. Physicians advised patients on appropriate winter regimens. Military trainers explicitly taught cold weather activity management, how to keep warm through movement without compromising combat readiness. Archaeological evidence preserves the infrastructure. Exercise equipment in Roman homes, gymnasium layouts designed for year-round use, architectural features suggesting spaces intended for physical activity regardless of season. The material culture shows that warming movement wasn't improvised but systematically integrated into built environments. The genius lay in integration. Romans didn't separate exercise from daily life. They understood that necessary work, social customs, physical conditioning all contributed to the same goal: maintaining body heat through winter. Every step to the forum, every household task, every ball game with friends was simultaneously practical necessity and survival strategy. Romans viewed their bodies as furnaces requiring two things: fuel and action. Food provided energy, but movement transformed that energy into heat. Stillness meant death, gradually or quickly depending on temperature and circumstances. Survival demanded constant engagement, the recognition that comfort in winter wasn't found in rest but in calibrated, deliberate activity that kept the internal fires burning. In this understanding, they were more sophisticated than many modern people who've outsourced warmth to technology and forgotten that the human body itself is the most portable, reliable heating system ever designed if you know how to stoke it. Roman physicians read the body like a map of invisible rivers. Their theories were myths, but their treatments sometimes saved lives anyway. When Galen examined a patient shivering through a Roman winter, he saw invisible fluids shifting beneath the skin. 4 humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile, flowing through channels no anatomist could find, their balance determining health or disease. Winter disrupted this equilibrium catastrophically. Cold and wet seasons increased phlegm, and black bile caused humours to stagnate and thicken, reduced vital heat that sustained life. The theory was complete fiction. The treatments, remarkably, often worked. Roman physicians inherited Greek humoral medicine wholesale, building elaborate frameworks on foundations of metaphor and speculation. Winter presented specific challenges in this worldview. The season itself was cold and wet, qualities that penetrated the body and altered internal balance. Phlegm accumulated in the lungs and head, manifesting as coughs, catarrh, and respiratory distress. Black bile, cold, dry, melancholic, dominated mental states, causing depression and torpor. Health required active intervention to counteract seasonal influences. The prescriptions flowed logically from flawed premises. Galen and other elite physicians recommended winter regimens combining multiple strategies: dietary shifts toward warming foods, fatty meats, wine, spices believed to possess inherent heat, exercise programs to maintain circulation and prevent humoral stagnation, and preventive treatments including herbal preparations to fortify the body against cold's invasion. Here's where theory and reality converged accidentally. Emphasis on maintaining circulation aligned perfectly with modern understanding of peripheral blood flow and hypothermia prevention. Dietary recommendations for calorie-dense foods supported thermogenesis, even if Romans attributed the effect to metaphysical heat rather than metabolic processes. Attention to bathing and skincare prevented conditions exacerbated by cold, crowding, and reduced hygiene. Empirically valid, even if justified by nonsensical theories about opening and closing pores to regulate humoral flow. Medical texts preserve both the theoretical framework and practical treatments. Celsus's De Medicina describes symptoms we recognize as hypothermia, profound shivering, mental confusion, dangerous lethargy. His prescribed treatment, gradual rewarming, warm beverages, friction massage to restore circulation, remains essentially correct 2 millennia later. He didn't understand why it worked, but observation taught what theory couldn't. Roman physicians recognized frostbite, though they conceptualized it as extreme cold penetrating flesh and freezing internal humors. They described the progression: numbness, white or dark discoloration, tissue death if untreated. Their remedies included gradual warming, gentle massage, and application of oil-based ointments, which prevented further damage even if they couldn't reverse necrosis. The treatments worked not because the theory was sound, but because physicians observed what helped and what harmed. Preventive medicine occupied Roman physicians extensively. Autumn consultations advised wealthy patrons to prepare bodies for winter, building strength through exercise and rich diet, gradually adjusting to temperature changes, taking herbal preparations believed to fortify against seasonal illness. Some recommendations were superstition, amulets, prayers, specific gemstones worn for protection. Others were practical wisdom dressed in theoretical clothing. Specific remedies filled medical texts and household practice. Olive oil applied to exposed skin prevented chapping and provided barrier against moisture loss, physiologically valid. Warming spices mixed with honey created medicinal syrups that eased respiratory symptoms, partly through genuine mild antimicrobial and anti-inflammatory properties. Poultices for cold-induced joint pain sometimes contained ingredients with actual analgesic effects, though Romans attributed relief to balancing humors rather than biochemical action. The social stratification of medical care created parallel medical worlds. Elite physicians served wealthy patrons who could afford personalized winter health regimens. Common Romans relied on folk healers, midwives, and informal practitioners who possessed generations of accumulated practical knowledge. Often, the folk remedies worked as well or better than elite medicine. Empirical trial and error sometimes outperformed elaborate theory. Limitations were severe. Roman physicians couldn't cure pneumonia or serious respiratory infections. They lacked germ theory, couldn't understand contagion, and had no effective treatments for the diseases that killed most winter victims. Serious conditions received treatments that were useless at best, actively harmful at worst. Bloodletting to balance humors, dangerous purgatives, toxic substances administered because theory demanded them. Yet the paradox persists in evidence. Roman winter survival rates, especially among those who could afford medical care, suggest physicians provided genuine benefit despite fundamental theoretical errors. How? Because medicine isn't just theory. It's observation, experience, trial and error accumulated over generations. Galen might have explained his treatments using phantom humors, but he documented what worked based on countless patients observed across decades of practice. The lesson transcends ancient medicine. Correct explanations matter less than effective interventions when survival is at stake. Romans navigated winter using a map that depicted imaginary geography, yet somehow it guided them to real destinations. The rivers of phlegm and bile didn't exist, but the warmth generated by following their supposed courses through diet, exercise, and treatment kept real people alive through real winters. Behind every Roman survival technique lurked a darker truth. They existed because cold killed, reliably and without mercy, winter after winter for centuries. Not everyone survived. The archaeological record doesn't preserve this directly, but demographic studies, skeletal analysis, and literary sources converge on uncomfortable reality. Winter mortality spiked. The very young, the very old, the very poor, these populations faced winter as a culling season, their bodies and circumstances unable to maintain the delicate thermal balance that kept others alive. Romans documented what we now call hypothermia with clinical precision, even without understanding its mechanisms. Medical texts describe the progression, extremities becoming cold and numb, shivering that eventually stops, a sign physicians recognized as ominous. Confusion and lethargy, skin turning bluish-white, and finally unresponsiveness. They observed that people pulled from cold water or caught in storms exhibited these symptoms in predictable sequence, and that without intervention, the sequence ended in death. Frostbite claimed soldiers and travelers most frequently. Frontier garrisons reported men losing fingers, toes, sometimes entire feet to extreme cold. The tissue damage followed visible patterns, initial numbness and pallor, then dark discoloration, finally blackening and death of flesh that sometimes required amputation. Romans lacked understanding of cellular ice crystal formation, but they saw the results and documented them in military medical records and veteran disability claims. Respiratory infections killed on a scale that made exposure deaths seem minor. Crowded urban environments, inadequate ventilation, bodies weakened by marginal nutrition, winter created perfect conditions for disease transmission. What Romans called catarrh encompassed everything from common colds to influenza to pneumonia. They observed seasonal patterns, illness spreading through households, tenement blocks experiencing waves of sickness, mortality clustering in the coldest months. Treatment options were limited. For early hypothermia, Roman first aid was surprisingly sound. Gradual warming near fires, not direct heat that could cause shock, warm beverages to raise core temperature, friction massage to restore circulation, wrapping in dry blankets. These interventions worked because they addressed the actual physiological problem, even if Romans explained them through humoral theory. Frostbite treatment was less effective. Physicians applied various ointments, olive oil-based preparations, sometimes with herbs or honey. They attempted to restore circulation through massage and gradual warming. For severe cases, they recognized amputation as the only option to prevent spread of tissue death, though without antiseptics or antibiotics, amputation itself often proved fatal. Respiratory illness exposed medical limitations starkly. Romans used steam inhalation, herbal preparations, rest, and prayer. Some treatments provided symptomatic relief. Honey soothed throats. Certain herbs had mild expectorant properties, but they couldn't cure bacterial pneumonia or influenza, couldn't stop disease transmission, couldn't prevent the respiratory infections that claimed thousands annually. The cascade effects compounded tragedy. Inadequate heating forced prolonged cold exposure. Malnutrition, common among poor Romans even in good times, weakened immune systems. Crowding for warmth facilitated disease spread. Minor conditions escalated to fatal ones because effective treatments didn't exist. A simple chest cold became pneumonia. A day of cold exposure became hypothermia. A winter storm became a death sentence for those caught unprepared. Vulnerability followed social lines with brutal clarity. Enslaved people forced to labor outdoors in minimal clothing. Homeless individuals sleeping in doorways and under bridges. Elderly bodies unable to generate sufficient heat or fight off infection. Infants whose small body mass and immature thermoregulation made them desperately vulnerable to cold stress. For these populations, winter wasn't hardship, it was existential threat. Romans understood vulnerability patterns empirically. They recognized that certain people needed extra protection, that gradual cold exposure built tolerance while sudden extremes were dangerous, that recovery from serious cold injury required extended warmth and rich nutrition. Medical texts advised special care for children and elderly. Military commanders knew that veteran soldiers survived conditions that killed new recruits. The psychological toll appears in literature between the lines. Martial's epigrams reference winter deaths with dark humor, masking genuine grief. Pliny describes cold-related tragedies with the clinical distance of a man who'd witnessed too many. Military records document exposure casualties with bureaucratic brevity that doesn't hide the human cost. Specific cases survived in writing. Travelers who froze attempting to cross alpine passes. Soldiers found dead at their posts after winter storms. Entire homeless populations decimated by particularly harsh winters. Each brief mention represents a death, a family's loss, a community diminished. Every technique described in previous sections, the hippocaust, the layered clothing, the warm wine and rich food, the architectural innovations, existed against this backdrop of genuine danger. They weren't curiosities or comfort measures. They were survival equipment in a war against an enemy that claimed lives every winter, that no amount of ingenuity could completely defeat. Roman winter survival is also a story of those who didn't survive, the thousands lost despite all knowledge and effort, their deaths teaching the living what cold could do when defense failed. Between the isolated family huddled in cold darkness and the empire's survival lay a web of aqueducts, grain distributions, and bathhouses, Rome's infrastructure of life itself. Winter survival wasn't just individual struggle. Behind every Roman who endured the cold months stood centuries of accumulated infrastructure, institutions designed to buffer population-level threats that would overwhelm isolated households. Roman emperors and magistrates understood what modern epidemiologists rediscovered. Maintaining population health was political necessity, essential for military recruitment, economic productivity, and the social stability that kept empires intact. The aqueduct system served as Rome's primary public health achievement. 11 aqueducts eventually supplied the capital with hundreds of millions of gallons of clean water daily, maintaining flow even through winter freezes. This mattered desperately when people crowded indoors. Contaminated water spreads disease catastrophically in dense populations. Clean water reduced winter illness even as conditions otherwise favored epidemic spread. Public baths functioned as winter survival infrastructure disguised as social amenity. Rome held hundreds of bath complexes, from imperial thermae to neighborhood facilities, offering heating and hygiene accessible across social classes. For poor Romans living in unheated tenement rooms, the baths provided hours of warmth, the chance to clean bodies and clothing, and social spaces that reduced winter's psychological isolation. Some baths stayed open late specifically to serve working populations who needed warmth after dark. The Cura Annoni, the grain dole, prevented winter starvation. Rome's government distributed free or subsidized grain to hundreds of thousands of citizens, a system that intensified during winter when food prices typically spiked due to transport difficulties and storage costs. This wasn't charity in the modern sense, it was political calculation. Emperors buying stability by ensuring the urban population didn't starve when weather disrupted supply chains. Winter sometimes prompted specific interventions. Records document emergency grain distributions during particularly harsh winters, additional fuel allocations for public facilities, and imperial largesse timed to coincide with seasonal hardship. Augustus, Vespasian, Trajan, multiple emperors funded winter relief programs, their inscriptions proudly commemorating provisions that kept populations alive through crisis. The Vigiles, Rome's combined fire and night watch force, served dual functions that intensified in winter. Beyond firefighting, more dangerous in cold months when heating fires multiplied, they patrolled streets checking on vulnerable populations, responding to cold-related emergencies, and maintaining order when weather drove desperate people to desperate acts. They were urban survival infrastructure made human. Charitable institutions supplemented official systems. Wealthy patrons funded winter assistance for clients and dependents. Not pure altruism, but patronage relationships that obligated elites to protect those beneath them. Collegia, guild associations organized around trades or neighborhoods, provided mutual aid including winter support for members. Some religious institutions offered shelter and assistance, proto-welfare organizations motivated by piety and community cohesion. But limitations were severe. Public health infrastructure served Rome and major cities far better than small towns or rural areas. Provincial cities might have one bathhouse where Rome had hundreds, one aqueduct where Rome had 11. The elite benefited disproportionately from public facilities designed to accommodate them. Crisis response was reactive, disaster-prompted action, but systematic prevention remained beyond Roman institutional capacity. Inscriptions preserve evidence of winter interventions, benefactors commemorating relief efforts, public records documenting expenditures on provisions, monuments depicting charitable distributions. These fragments suggest broader patterns. Winter required collective response, and Roman society had mechanisms, however imperfect, to mobilize that response. Over centuries, Roman public health understanding evolved empirically. They recognized patterns. Crowding increased disease, heating reduced mortality, nutrition affected survival. They institutionalized responses without understanding biological mechanisms. No germ theory, but plenty of observation about what worked. After the Great Fire, building codes changed to improve safety. Epidemics prompted enhanced attention to water quality. Military medical innovations sometimes filtered into civilian practice as veterans brought knowledge home. The system wasn't universal or equitable. Rural poor, non-citizens, enslaved people, millions fell outside public health infrastructure's protection. But within its reach, the system represented genuine collective effort to improve survival odds across populations, recognition that individual endurance required social support. Roman winter survival wasn't atomized families fighting cold in isolation. It was individual strategies nested within social systems, personal resilience supported by collective infrastructure, the understanding that survival was both private responsibility and public concern, a web of support as essential as any hippocaust or woolen cloak. In the longest nights, when cold penetrated stone and will alike, Romans fought a second battle, not against frost, but against the darkness of their own minds. Modern psychology has a name for what Romans experienced without naming: seasonal affective disorder, the documented decline in mood, energy, and mental health that tracks winter's arrival. Romans lacked clinical terminology, but they lived the reality: months of darkness that stretched from late afternoon through morning, cold that confined bodies to cramped interior spaces, isolation that severed social connections, and constant low-grade anxiety about illness, fire, and the simple grinding hardship of enduring until spring. At Rome's latitude, winter nights consumed 14 to 15 hours of every 24. Further north in Britannia or Germania, soldiers faced even longer darkness. Without artificial lighting beyond oil lamps and candles, expensive, dim, insufficient, night meant genuine darkness. People went to bed because there was nothing else to do, woke in darkness, and lived through abbreviated days that offered minimal sunlight even when skies cleared. Literary sources preserve evidence of winter melancholy. Poets wrote about winter's oppressiveness, the lethargy that seized them, the low spirits that accompanied dark months. Medical texts acknowledged that winter affected mental as well as physical health, describing seasonal changes in mood and energy that physicians attributed to humoral imbalances but nonetheless recognized as real phenomena. Romans fought back with deliberate psychological strategies. They maintained social connections through winter gatherings, dinners, small parties, visits to the baths. They kept mentally active through storytelling, board games, dice, conversation. The wealthy engaged in intellectual pursuits, reading, writing, philosophical discussion. Activity wasn't just distraction, it was psychological survival equipment. Stoic philosophy, widely influential across Roman society, provided powerful mental framework. Stoicism taught that external conditions, cold, darkness, discomfort, were indifferent, neither good nor evil in themselves. Virtue lay in maintaining equanimity regardless of circumstances, accepting what you couldn't control while controlling your response. This wasn't empty abstraction. For Romans enduring months of cold, it was practical psychology. Winter isn't happening to you, it's simply happening. Your suffering is optional. Different social groups adapted this resilience differently. Soldiers relied on unit cohesion and military identity. Shared hardship built bonds, and the knowledge that others endured the same conditions sustained individual willpower. Families used domestic rituals, shared meals, evening routines, the continuity of daily life providing structure against winter's chaos. Urban poor drew on neighborhood solidarity, the tenement block community that shared resources and psychological support. The wealthy buffered winter's psychological impact with luxury and entertainment. They could afford distraction. Romans recognized light's importance even without understanding seasonal affective disorders mechanisms. They valued sunny winter days, positioned windows to capture maximum daylight, and increased lamp and candle use despite the expense. Some evidence suggests they understood empirically that darkness itself affected mood, that light wasn't just practical necessity, but psychological medicine. Winter functioned as cultural test. Roman society valorized endurance, resilience, the ability to withstand hardship without complaint. Successfully surviving winter, maintaining discipline, fulfilling responsibilities, staying functional through months of difficulty, provided psychological satisfaction and social status. This was particularly true for soldiers, whose winter endurance became marker of military virtue. Specific practices sustained spirits through dark months. Maintaining daily routines provided structure and purpose when winter's formlessness threatened to overwhelm. Setting spring goals, planning next year's crops, anticipating construction projects, looking forward to military campaigns, gave people forward-looking hope rather than fixating on present hardship. Celebrating winter milestones broke monotony, the winter solstice marking the turning point, Saturnalia's scheduled joy, other festivals punctuating the long darkness with deliberate celebration. The psychological battle was real. Romans who lost this fight succumbed to what they called winter melancholy, debilitating depression that made survival tasks impossible. Those who won it did so through mental discipline as deliberate as any physical preparation, the recognition that winter assaulted not just body but spirit, and that spirit required its own defenses. In this, Romans were more sophisticated than many modern people who view psychological resilience as innate rather than cultivated, who assume mood is simply what happens rather than something partially within control. Roman winter survival required mental fortitude built through practice, philosophical frameworks that gave meaning to suffering, and social structures that prevented isolation's slow psychological dissolution. They understood what winter's longest nights taught anyone who survived them. The cold outside kills quickly, but the cold inside kills slower and just as surely. In mid-December, something in Rome began to loosen. The days still ended early, breath still showed in the air, and the stones of the city kept the night's chill like a secret. Yet as Saturnalia approached, people walked with a different pace. They spoke of it the way you speak of a lamp being carried down a hallway, not the light itself, but the promise that it was coming. The timing mattered. Around the solstice, when darkness seemed to have won, the turning of the year offered a quiet assurance that daylight would return. Saturnalia arrived like a declaration that winter was not the final ruler. It began on December 17th and could stretch through the 23rd, long enough to change the mood of a whole city. Normal rules softened, then inverted. Masters served slaves at table, and a servant could speak with a boldness that would be unthinkable a week earlier. A cap of freedom appeared on heads, a small symbol with an enormous message. For these nights, the world would pretend to be equal. Gambling and games, usually frowned upon, were suddenly permitted. Laughter spilled from doorways, and people took chances with dice as if they could roll the season itself into a kinder shape. The festival was full of comforts that went deeper than amusement. Kitchens worked harder than usual, and the extra heat from cooking warmed more than the food. Candles and lamps multiplied, turning cramped rooms into bright little islands against the long dark. Richer dishes broke the monotony of winter meals, and wine loosened worries that cold weather tightened. Crowded gatherings created their own warmth, bodies close enough that the chill had fewer places to hide. When darkness pressed deepest and cold gripped hardest, Romans lit candles, reversed the world, and laughed at winter, not from ignorance of its danger, but from wisdom about survival. Saturnalia's joy had practical value. Feasting was not just indulgence, it was fuel. In the season when the body burned more energy simply staying warm, extra calories could mean the difference between enduring and failing. Gift-giving, too, was more than decoration. Small presents, candles, food, tokens of money, simple necessities, moved resources through neighborhoods and households. Even modest gifts mattered when a family's stores were thin, and the social mixing, the deliberate softening of class lines, refreshed relationships that could later become help. A favor, a loan, a shared meal, a place by the fire when something went wrong. Roman writers left glimpses that make the festival feel close. Catullus called it the best of days, a line that carries the relief of someone who has watched winter close in and felt it finally pause. Martial wrote about the gifts and the joking mood, the small objects that became symbols of care. Seneca, always alert to human habits, noted the noise and disorder with a mixture of amusement and caution, as if even joy should be observed closely. Pliny mentions the season's practices in passing, the way people mention something so familiar it hardly needs explanation. And in the archaeological record, there are hints of special preparations, changes in household activity, and the marks of gatherings that would have brightened the bleak weeks. Saturnalia was not alone. The solstice itself, the simple fact of the sun's turning, carried weight. Other religious observances in winter honoured gods tied to protection, plenty, and renewal, giving people a story to hold on to when the weather felt like an enemy. Then came the calends of January, the new year, with its sense of reset and fresh counting. These occasions broke winter into segments like stepping stones across cold water. Instead of an endless stretch, there were markers, a festival to reach, a feast to prepare, a day to name the next chapter. Even preparation became a kind of medicine. Planning meals, arranging visits, making small gifts, decorating a corner of a room. These were purposeful tasks when work outside slowed and darkness filled extra hours. Anticipation gave the mind something warm to touch. Memories of past Saturnalias offered proof that winter had been endured before and would be endured again. Different people tasted the season differently. The wealthy hosted elaborate dinners and displayed generosity, which also displayed power. Middle households joined communal celebrations, stretching budgets for a richer pot and a few small gifts. The poor found relief in public cheer, in charity, in shared food, and in the rare sense that the city's joy belonged to them too. In all cases, the festivals functioned like a tool, a technology of hope, made of light, laughter, and shared time. And from that public warmth, the story turns inward, toward quieter rituals at home, the private beliefs and daily practices that kept families steady through winter's long nights. In the Roman winter, when streets grew quiet and smoke hung low, protection began at home, not with locks alone, but with a small corner reserved for the unseen. Nearly every household kept a lararium, a shrine where painted figures and tiny statues watched daily life. Here lived the lares, guardians of place and family, and the penates, protectors of the storeroom's plenty. Their presence felt steady in a season that did not. Morning and evening, hands that also kneaded dough and mended cloth paused to offer something simple. A pinch of salt, a crumb of cake, a few drops of wine, a curl of incense. In winter, those gestures often grew more careful. After hearing of a fire nearby, a man might linger longer before the shrine. A mother might speak over the grain jar, asking it to last until the next market. Children learned the words by listening, then repeating until prayer became as ordinary as sweeping. The hearth carried special weight. Its flame warmed hands and boiled water, yet it was also sacred, tied to Vesta, whose protection meant continuity. Tending the fire became a duty that felt larger than comfort. Ashes were gathered neatly, embers banked with attention, and careless sparks were treated as more than clumsiness. To keep the hearth alive through long nights was to say that the household still held together. Winter brought vows as well, whispered at thresholds and doorposts. Some promised a gift if the family reached spring, a small figurine, a candle, a portion of the first fresh fruit. Others marked the season's beginning with a request for shelter from storms or strength against cough and fever. When cold and hunger pressed, increasing an offering could feel like taking action, however small, against a world that rarely explained itself. Archaeology preserves these habits in quiet traces: soot-darkened niches, worn altars, little bowls stained by repeated libations, and votive objects left in thanks or desperation. Wall paintings show families gathered before the shrine, palms open, as if the room could become a temple. At every threshold and hearth, Romans whispered prayers that merged with smoke, invocations that turned cold stone into sacred space and winter survival into spiritual victory. These practices were not only private. Neighborhood shrines, shared rites, and the pull of mystery cults offered warmth of another kind, belonging. People who might never share a table could share a ritual and a promise to meet again. In a season that narrowed life to essentials, community made those essentials easier to find. Healing also crossed into the sacred. A poultice might be applied with a prayer, a fever watched with an offering, a visit to a healer paired with a vow to a god. Where remedies could not guarantee outcomes, devotion supplied a language for hope. And when hope failed, belief offered a frame for loss. Proper rites honored the dead, kept them within memory, and reassured the living that order might exist beyond a cruel night. By the time the first, softer mornings arrived, Romans had endured not by strength alone, but by weaving body, household, neighbors, and gods into one net. Soon winter would loosen its grip for good, and the city would greet the return of green with the same seriousness it had given to smoke and flame. Every lengthening day, every returning bird, every thawing stream whispered the same ancient promise to frozen Romans: survival, vindication, spring. Romans lived closer to natural rhythms than most modern people, and winter made them desperate observers of every sign that darkness was yielding. The winter solstice, December 21st by our calendar, marked the critical turning point. Days began lengthening, barely perceptibly at first, but Romans noticed. They tracked the sun's arc, watched how shadows shortened at noon, observed how afternoon light lasted minutes longer each day. This wasn't casual interest. It was survival mathematics, each additional daylight minute proving that endurance was working, that spring would eventually return. They watched the sky for messengers. Specific bird migrations announced seasonal transitions with reliability humans could trust. Cranes returning from Africa, swallows appearing after months of absence, starling flocks changing their patterns. These weren't just natural phenomena, but temporal markers Romans used to orient themselves in winter's formless flow. Pliny's natural history catalogues these indicators with the precision of a man who understood they mattered. Astronomical knowledge supplemented observation. Romans inherited Greek understanding of solstices and equinoxes, tracked the sun's changing position against background stars, and used various calendars organizing the year around seasonal transitions. The elite consulted astronomical tables and complex calculations. Common Romans used simpler markers: shadows cast by buildings at noon, the rising and setting points of the sun against familiar landmarks, the visible positions of constellations. This knowledge served immediate survival. Predicting winter's end allowed proper resource rationing. Knowing you had 6 more weeks versus 12 determined whether you could increase daily food consumption or needed to continue strict economy. It provided psychological goals, specific dates to endure until, concrete milestones that broke winter's psychological monotony into manageable segments. And it enabled practical preparation. Farmers needed lead time to prepare fields, builders to stockpile materials, soldiers to plan spring campaigns. Different groups read different signs. Farmers watched soil conditions, when frozen earth began softening, when first green shoots appeared in sheltered locations. They tested soil temperature with experienced hands, judged moisture levels, observed which weeds emerged first. Soldiers on frontier duty noted weather pattern changes, the character of storms shifting, wind directions changing, the quality of cold moderating from killing freeze to merely uncomfortable. Urban dwellers observed market changes, fresh foods appearing again, prices dropping as winter transport difficulties eased, increased outdoor commercial activity. Agricultural calendars preserved these observations systematically. Surviving Roman farm manuals specify seasonal tasks by calendar date, by astronomical position, and by natural indicators. Belt and suspenders approach, recognizing that nature sometimes defied calendars, but patterns held across years. Festivals marked winter's retreat. Lupercalia in mid-February served as purification ritual preparing for spring's renewal. Various agricultural festivals celebrated returning growth. Offerings to deities who controlled seasons. Communal acknowledgement that survival depended on forces beyond human control. The spring equinox, when day and night balanced before light's ultimate triumph, carried profound emotional weight. The first genuinely warm day brought palpable relief. Literary sources describe this moment: sudden awareness that the sun actually warmed rather than merely illuminated, that outdoor air felt pleasant rather than hostile, that winter had broken. Spring flowers, crocuses, early narcissus, created disproportionate joy, their appearance confirming what lengthening days promised. Energy and mood lifted visibly as darkness released its psychological grip. But Romans knew spring was treacherous. Arrival was gradual, not sudden. Warm days could yield to winter's return, late snows, freezing rains, cold snaps that killed early plantings, and reminded humans that seasons didn't respect their desire for neat transitions. Experienced Romans maintained winter precautions until truly stable warm weather arrived, typically not until after the spring equinox. Regional variations complicated prediction. Mediterranean provinces experienced spring by late February or early March. Northern frontiers waited until April or even May. Romans adjusted expectations to local climate, and those transferred between regions learned new indicators. What signaled spring in Syria didn't apply to Britannia. The knowledge provided both practical advantage and profound psychological comfort. In winter's darkest moments, when cold seemed eternal and endurance impossible, Romans knew spring would return because it always had. Celestial mechanics guaranteed it. Natural patterns confirmed it. Every winter that had ever been had ended. This certainty wasn't naive optimism, it was earned wisdom, observational knowledge accumulated across centuries, the understanding that seasonal cycles were perhaps the one reliable constant in an uncertain world. That promise, survival, vindication, spring, sustained Romans through the final frozen weeks when willpower frayed and bodies ached and the psychological battle grew hardest. Just endure a little longer. The light is returning. Winter always ends. As ice melted into memory and shadows shortened towards summer, Romans didn't just emerge from winter, they rose from it, transformed by survival into something harder, wiser, and eternally grateful for warmth. The first genuinely warm day arrived as sensory explosion, sunlight that actually warmed skin rather than merely illuminating cold air, clear blue sky stretching overhead after months of oppressive grey. Street sounds increasing, voices, cartwheels, commerce as people flooded outdoors from winter confinement. The city exhaling after holding its breath for months. Bodies relaxed in ways Romans had forgotten were possible. Muscles perpetually tensed against cold finally released. Shoulders dropped, jaws unclenched. The constant low-grade vigilance around fire safety could ease. Heating fires no longer essential. The daily calculus of warmth versus danger temporarily suspended. Simple existence stopped requiring such exhausting effort. Homes transformed. Windows and doors could open, flooding dark interiors with light and fresh air. The accumulated smoke of months from braziers, oil lamps, cooking fires finally cleared, replaced by spring breezes carrying scents of wet earth and growing things. Heating fires could be reduced or extinguished entirely, freeing fuel resources and eliminating the constant maintenance they demanded. People shed their layers, moving freely in single tunics rather than bundled beneath multiple cloaks. Emotional transformations matched physical ones. Winter depression lifted with the lengthening days and returning warmth. Modern research confirms what Romans experienced, that increased sunlight and comfortable temperatures directly improve mood and energy. Social interaction exploded as people spent hours outdoors in public spaces they'd avoided through winter. The anxiety could finally release. The constant worry about fuel running out, food supplies dwindling, illness striking, fire consuming everything. Survival was no longer daily battle but achieved fact. Neighborhoods that had been ghost quiet through winter suddenly animated with street life. Children played outdoors, workshops opened their fronts to light and air, neighbors gathered in doorways and squares, markets filled with fresh goods that had been unavailable for months, early vegetables, fresh fish, products from countryside farms emerging from winter isolation. Public spaces saw renewed use. forums filled with business and legal activity that had slowed during cold months. Bath complexes welcomed visitors who came for pleasure rather than desperate warmth. Theatres and amphitheatres prepared for spring performance seasons. The entire infrastructure of Roman urban life, muted through winter, roared back to full volume. Practical transitions consumed households. Stored winter foods, salted meats, preserved vegetables, dried fruits, could finally be replaced with fresh options that tasted of something other than survival. Winter clothing required cleaning and careful storage against moths and rot. Homes needed thorough cleaning after months of closed conditions and continuous occupation. And everywhere, damage assessment, broken roof tiles, water infiltration, structural problems masked by winter's urgency but demanding spring attention. Ritual marked the transition. Romans performed purification ceremonies, washing away winter's contamination, preparing homes and bodies for renewal. They made offerings of thanks to the gods who controlled seasons, gratitude for survival mixed with supplication for favourable spring weather. Spring festivals celebrated return to life. Liberalia, honouring Liber and Libera, agricultural deities, various local observances particular to regions and communities. The psychological significance ran deeper than simple relief. Surviving winter provided tangible accomplishment. Families could count their members and mourn those lost, but survivors felt vindication. We endured. We're still here. Communities came together not just in relief, but in shared pride. We made it through another one. Different groups experienced spring distinctively. Soldiers on frontier duty felt particular relief as immediate survival pressures eased, even as campaigning season approached with its own dangers. Farmers faced spring's intense labour demands, ploughing, planting, repairs, but welcomed the end of enforced winter idleness. Urban Romans enjoyed renewed access to goods, entertainment, and the full social life that made cities bearable. But spring wasn't uniformly positive. Some who'd survived winter's worst fell ill in changeable spring weather. Temperature swings, lingering dampness, weakened immune systems succumbing to new exposures. Winter damage revealed itself: depleted stores, broken equipment, structural problems requiring expensive repairs. The memory of hardship remained even as conditions improved, a psychic residue that coloured spring joy with winter's shadow. Romans who emerged weren't unchanged. They carried knowledge earned through endurance, resilience built through months of disciplined survival, and gratitude for warmth that only those who've been genuinely cold can fully comprehend. They'd been tested and had not broken. That transformation from winter's victims to its survivors was spring's deepest gift. In every Roman road, every aqueduct stone, every Stoic maxim lay a hidden truth. They were answers winter had demanded, written in frost and remembered in civilization. Roman greatness wasn't accidental. Behind the engineering marvels, the military dominance, the cultural achievements that defined Western civilization lay a less celebrated driver: winter. Centuries of winter survival across the empire's climatic diversity forced innovations, refined strategies, and shaped cultural characteristics that we still recognize as distinctively Roman. Consider the engineering. 11 aqueducts supplying Rome with hundreds of millions of gallons daily weren't just impressive, they were winter survival infrastructure. Year-round clean water access prevented disease when people crowded indoors. The flow continued through freezes because Romans engineered for reliability, not just capacity. Roads spanning continents enabled rapid communication and supply in all seasons. Roman military success depended on moving legions and provisions regardless of weather. These weren't monuments to imperial ego, they were systematic responses to environmental challenges. Architectural innovations reflected accumulated climate wisdom. Hypercaust systems, sophisticated window glass, carefully oriented buildings, roof designs that shed snow and rain. Each represented generations of trial and error, knowledge preserved and transmitted through building practices. Romans didn't just survive winter, they encoded survival into their built environment. Military effectiveness depended fundamentally on cold weather capability. Roman legions could campaign and survive in northern climates that paralyzed less prepared opponents. This wasn't just better equipment, it was systematic logistics, training that built cold tolerance, institutional knowledge about winter survival that became part of military culture. A German or Gallic warrior might be individually fiercer, but Roman soldiers survived winters that killed tribal armies, then fought effectively in spring. Strategic advantage written in frost. Winter shaped Roman values at the deepest level. Stoic philosophy's emphasis on endurance resonated because Romans regularly faced genuine hardship. Amor fati, love of fate, acceptance of what you cannot change, wasn't abstract philosophy, but practical psychology for people who annually confronted months of cold they couldn't escape. cultural valorization of resilience and discipline reflected survival requirements. Romans took pride in their ability to thrive across the empire's climatic diversity. From Syrian deserts to German forests, they adapted and persisted. Winter made inequality visceral. Differential access to warmth wasn't abstract social theory but immediate physical reality. Those who could afford hypocausts, imported fuel, thick clothing versus those who huddled in unheated tenements wearing threadbare wool. Status was literally written on bodies, in frostbite scars and winter-damaged health. Some Roman social welfare emerged from pragmatic recognition that public order required preventing mass winter mortality. The grain dole, public baths, emergency relief. These weren't pure altruism but calculated responses to the reality that letting the poor freeze or starve destabilized everyone. This knowledge outlived Rome. Medieval Europeans inherited hypocaust technology, adapted it into monastic heating systems. Roman textile knowledge, layering principles, fabric choices informed medieval clothing. Military cold weather strategies influenced later army organization. Renaissance scholars rediscovering Roman texts found winter survival knowledge alongside philosophy and poetry. Specific innovations traced lineages through centuries. Hypocausts evolved into later underfloor heating. Roman understanding of wind patterns and building orientation informed medieval and Renaissance architecture. The systematic approach to winter preparation, stockpiling, preservation, advanced planning became cultural template across European civilizations. Winter created cultural memory that shaped behavior for generations. Romans remembered particular harsh winters, these memories influencing planning and preparation decades later. The collective experience of seasonal challenges contributed to social cohesion. Shared hardship created bonds across social classes, common enemy that everyone faced regardless of status. The paradox: winter hardship contributed to Roman success. Challenges of maintaining empire across diverse climates drove innovations that served Romans in multiple contexts. Survival strategies developed for winter had military, engineering, and social applications beyond cold weather contexts. Cultural emphasis on endurance, built through annual winter survival, served Romans facing various adversities, military defeats, political upheavals, economic crises. They'd learned through frozen months that you endure, you adapt, you survive. Every technique discussed in this documentary existed because winter demanded it. Hypocausts answered the question, how do we keep soldiers alive on frozen frontiers? Layered clothing solved, how do we protect bodies from killing cold? Stoic philosophy addressed, how do we maintain psychological resilience through months of darkness and hardship? Roman civilization was partly forged in frost, shaped by the annual test of surviving cold that came every year without fail. The roads, the aqueducts, the architecture, the philosophy, the military prowess. These weren't separate achievements, but interconnected responses to environmental challenges. Winter was teacher, testing every innovation, refining every practice, eliminating what didn't work and preserving what did. Romans who survived centuries of winters learned lessons that became civilizational DNA, knowledge so fundamental it shaped how they built, fought, thought, and organized society. In this sense, understanding Roman winter survival illuminates more than ancient daily life. It reveals how practical challenges drive cultural evolution, how civilizations are built from the ground up by people solving immediate problems, and how the aggregate of countless individual survival strategies across generations creates the larger patterns we recognize as civilization itself. What if the Romans, who froze through countless winters, understood survival in ways we've traded for thermostats? And what if we need that wisdom back? Turn down the heat in a modern home and watch what happens. Panic sets in around 60 degrees Fahrenheit, a temperature Romans would have considered comfortable luxury. At 50 degrees, many people genuinely believe they're in danger. At 40, they're calling emergency services. This isn't weakness, it's disconnection. Modern heating technology has severed the knowledge that kept humans alive for millennia. Romans routinely experienced cold that would terrify most contemporary people in developed nations. They survived not through ignorance but through sophisticated understanding of how bodies interact with cold, how to manage resources, and how to maintain function in conditions we've engineered ourselves never to face. That knowledge is nearly extinct, lost in 3 generations of climate-controlled existence. Consider what Romans understood that we've forgotten. Body heat is a resource to be managed and shared, not just an individual concern. Modern homes separate people into individual heated rooms. Romans slept together, shared spaces, recognized that collective warmth was more efficient than isolated heating. This wasn't just practical, it was physics, and it created social bonds as byproduct of thermal efficiency. Layering and material choice matter more than bulk. Romans mastered textile combinations for different conditions. Modern people typically own heavy coats for cold weather without understanding that 3 thin layers outperform 1 thick garment, or that material matters. Wool retains warmth when wet, cotton becomes dangerous, linen serves as effective base layer. This knowledge wasn't luxury, it was survival information accessible to all classes. Activity generates warmth more effectively than passive heating. Romans deliberately moved before sleep to raise core temperature, calibrated exertion to conditions, understood that stillness meant cold. Modern sedentary lifestyles combined with constant heating have made people forget that the human body is a furnace requiring fuel and action. You're not cold, you're insufficiently active for current conditions. Why does this matter now? Climate change brings more extreme and unpredictable weather. Power grids fail, energy costs rise, and beneath practical concerns lies a deeper issue. People who've never experienced manageable discomfort panic when comfort systems fail. Resilience requires experience with adversity, and modern life often denies that experience until crisis hits. Specific Roman practices align with modern science once you strip away humoral theory. Keeping feet warm and head covered reflects physiological reality. You lose massive heat through extremities and head. Their segmented sleep with night waking matches natural human sleep architecture that artificial lighting disrupted. Dietary shifts toward fatty, calorie-dense foods in winter match nutritional science on thermogenesis. Social connection for warmth and psychological support addresses contemporary isolation epidemics. Some Roman wisdom persists in pockets. Mediterranean cultures still emphasize afternoon meals and evening routines echoing Roman patterns. Traditional architecture in mountain regions incorporates thermal mass and passive heating strategies Romans would recognize. Military cold weather training includes techniques with Roman precedents, layering systems, activity management, buddy checks for hypothermia symptoms. The broader wisdom transcends specific techniques. Romans understood humans as part of nature, subject to seasonal rhythms, rather than able to completely override them. Modern culture positions nature as enemy to be conquered through technology, creating dependence that becomes dangerous when systems fail. Romans recognized that comfort exists on a spectrum, that moderate discomfort is normal and manageable rather than emergency. Contemporary consumer culture has pathologized normal cold, positioning it as problem requiring purchase solutions, thermostats, specialized gear, emergency services. This creates anxiety about conditions previous generations considered unremarkable. They knew psychological preparation affects physical cold tolerance. Stoic frameworks for endurance weren't just philosophy but practical psychology that made hardship more bearable. Modern culture lacks similar frameworks, leaving people psychologically unprepared for discomfort they'll inevitably face. Romans understood survival as communal. The contubernium system, neighborhood solidarity, family cooperation. These weren't sentimentality but recognition that individual survival often requires collective support. Modern individualism downplays mutual aid, leaving people more vulnerable and isolated. Why did we lose this knowledge? Industrialization and fossil fuels made heating cheap and abundant for several generations. Urbanization reduced connection to seasonal rhythms. Office workers experienced climate-controlled environments year-round. Consumer culture positioned comfort as product to purchase rather than skill to develop. And it worked, for a while in specific circumstances, for specific populations. Consequences accumulate: reduced resilience when heating fails or power goes out, increased anxiety about discomfort that creates dependence on systems that aren't always reliable, weakened social bonds that once provided mutual aid, loss of body literacy, the ability to read and respond appropriately to physical signals about cold. The irony cuts deep. Modern people have more technology but may be less prepared for genuine hardship than ancient Romans. Romans had skills, knowledge, and social support that didn't depend on infrastructure. Modern survival often requires functional electrical grids, supply chains, emergency services, systems that sometimes fail precisely when you need them most. Roman wisdom offers genuine value beyond survival scenarios. Understanding thermal mass and passive heating could reduce energy consumption and costs. Dietary strategies for cold weather could improve health. Social practices could address isolation and mental health challenges. Psychological frameworks for endurance could build resilience applicable to various life challenges. Reclaiming this knowledge doesn't mean rejecting modern comforts or romanticizing ancient hardship. It means building skills and understanding that make you less dependent and more resilient. It means recognizing that your ancestors survived through knowledge rather than just technology, and that knowledge remains valid even when technology exists. The Romans who froze through countless winters would find modern panic at 60-degree temperatures incomprehensible, but they'd also recognize the vulnerability it represents. People who don't know how to be cold are people who can't survive when heating fails, and heating eventually always fails. Every Roman strategy, refined through centuries of survival, can become a modern tool, not for mere survival, but for resilient, intentional, connected winter living. You're not facing a Roman winter. Your home has heating, you own winter clothing, food is available year-round. But Roman wisdom still offers genuine value, improving comfort, reducing energy costs, enhancing health, and building resilience that serves you when systems fail or circumstances change. Start with layering. Romans understood that 3 thin layers outperform 1 thick garment because trapped air provides insulation. Modern application: base layer of moisture-wicking material, synthetic or merino wool, never cotton, which retains moisture. Insulating middle layer of wool or fleece, windproof outer layer when outdoors. Indoors, add 1 layer before raising the thermostat. Quality wool socks, Romans prized wool for good reason, provide warmth even when damp. Cover your head indoors with a light cap when cold. You lose significant heat through your skull. Gradually build tolerance. Lower your thermostat 1 degree per week until you reach 65 to 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Your body will adapt, your energy bills will drop, and you'll be more comfortable in varied temperatures. This isn't deprivation, it's recalibration to what human bodies handled for millennia. Adopt thermal routines. Romans warmed themselves before sleep. You can do the same. A hot shower or bath raises core temperature, providing warmth that persists for hours. Drink warm beverages. Herbal tea with honey echoes Roman preparations and provides genuine comfort. 10 minutes of light exercise before bed generates internal heat and improves sleep quality. If you use electric blankets or heating pads, warm your bed before getting in, rather than running them all night. Reclaim shared warmth. During power outages or extreme cold, gather family members in one room. Body heat accumulates. Sleep closer together. Pets provide genuine warmth. There's a reason Romans valued dogs in winter. Social gathering for warmth isn't just emergency strategy, it's opportunity for connection that modern life often denies. Adjust your diet seasonally. Romans emphasized calorie-dense, warming foods in winter. Modern nutrition science validates this. Increase healthy fats, nuts, olive oil, fatty fish. Make hearty soups and stews that provide both nutrition and warmth. Root vegetables, whole grains, warming spices like ginger and cinnamon. Notice that traditional winter recipes across cultures echo these principles. There's biological wisdom in comfort foods. One-pot meals served hot recall Roman practicality. The act of cooking generates heat, eating warm food raises body temperature, and communal meals provide social warmth. Modern convenience foods often skip these benefits. Modify your environment using Roman principles. Heavy curtains insulate windows. Close them at dusk to trap heat. Close off unused rooms, concentrating warmth in occupied spaces. Place rugs on cold floors. Romans understood that cold rising from below makes rooms feel colder. Create smaller, cozier spaces rather than heating entire homes uniformly. Position furniture to create sheltered areas away from drafts. Romans oriented spaces to block wind. You can arrange rooms to minimize cold airflow. Seal obvious drafts but maintain some ventilation, completely sealed. Modern homes can develop air quality problems Romans avoided through necessary leakiness. Embrace psychological practices. Romans maintained routines and rituals. Structure provides psychological stability through winter's formlessness. Maximize daylight exposure. Open curtains during sunny days. Spend time near windows. Take brief outdoor walks in daylight. Set winter goals that provide purpose and forward momentum. Create personal traditions marking winter's progression. Solstice celebrations, weekly rituals, anything that breaks monotony and provides anticipation. Romans celebrated winter festivals deliberately. You can too. Host small gatherings, share meals, create joy intentionally, rather than waiting for spring to feel better. This addresses seasonal affective disorder as effectively as some medical interventions. Build cold tolerance gradually and safely. Romans didn't suddenly endure harsh conditions, they adapted over time. Spend brief periods outside in cold weather, properly dressed. Use contrast temperature therapy, alternating warm and cool exposure, to improve adaptation. Cold showers seem extreme, but starting with 30 seconds of cool water at the end of a warm shower provides health benefits and builds resilience. Important caveats. These practices enhance modern comfort and resilience, but don't replace necessary heating. Vulnerable populations, elderly, very young, chronically ill, need proper warmth. Building tolerance should be gradual. Never ignore genuine cold stress symptoms. The goal is resilient comfort, not suffering. Consider community applications. Neighborhoods could organize winter mutual aid networks, checking on isolated members, sharing resources during emergencies, providing social connection. Communities could create winter gathering spaces. Some churches, libraries, and community centers already serve this function. Recognizing and supporting them continues Roman tradition of public spaces providing winter refuge. The empowerment is real. Romans survived without any modern advantages through knowledge, skill, and community. You have ancient wisdom plus contemporary resources, insulated homes, modern materials, medical care, abundant food. Combining both makes you exceptionally prepared while reducing dependence on energy-intensive systems that aren't always reliable or affordable. Start small, lower your thermostat 2 degrees and add a layer. Make soup for dinner, take a walk in cold weather. Each small practice builds skills and confidence. You're not preparing for catastrophe. You're reclaiming agency over your comfort, reducing vulnerability to system failures, and honoring the knowledge that kept your ancestors alive. Romans would find modern heating miraculous, but they'd also recognize that people who can only be comfortable at 72 degrees are fundamentally dependent, their comfort hostage to functioning infrastructure. Knowledge creates freedom. Skills create resilience. And resilience, the ability to maintain function across varying conditions, is perhaps the most valuable inheritance ancient people can offer modern descendants. In the end, Roman winter survival reveals not just how ancient people stayed warm, but what it means to be human, adaptable, communal, resilient, and capable of finding light even in the longest darkness. We began with a question: how did Romans survive winter without modern heating? We've traveled through hypocausts and wool cloaks, warm wine and shared body heat, Stoic philosophy and military brotherhood. We've watched spring arrive and considered what ancient wisdom offers modern lives. But beneath every technique and technology lies a deeper truth about human capacity. Romans survived winters that would kill unprepared modern people. Not because they were physiologically different, they felt cold exactly as we do, suffered the same way, faced the same dangers. They survived through knowledge, skills, attitudes, and social bonds. Strip away the specific Roman context, and what remains is proof of human adaptability. We can thrive in hostile conditions through ingenuity, cooperation, and resilience. This reveals something important: we're far more capable than comfortable modern life suggests. Climate-controlled homes, abundant food, technological solutions to every discomfort. These represent genuine human achievement, goods we shouldn't dismiss or reject, but they may obscure capacities that once defined human existence. Hardship builds qualities that ease cannot develop. Romans who endured winter emerged stronger, more resilient, more bonded to those who suffered alongside them. Modern elimination of most hardship might weaken something essential, not just physical toughness, but psychological resilience, the bone-deep knowledge that you can endure. There's wisdom in what Romans called useful discomfort, not suffering for its own sake, but the recognition that moderate, managed challenge builds capacity. Complete elimination of all discomfort may not serve human flourishing. Maintaining some connection to seasonal variation, to physical challenge, to the reality that nature doesn't always accommodate human preference. Perhaps these aren't sacrifices, but opportunities. The social dimension cuts deeper. Roman survival was fundamentally communal. 8 soldiers sharing a barracks room, families huddled together, neighborhoods supporting vulnerable members, society building aqueducts, baths, grain distribution, infrastructure enabling collective survival. This challenges modern individualism's mythology of self-sufficiency. Resilience isn't just personal, it's social. The strongest individual, isolated, is vulnerable. Community provides redundancy, mutual aid, shared knowledge, and psychological support that makes endurance possible. Romans understood this empirically. Modern culture sometimes forgets it until crisis forces rediscovery. Consider meaning and purpose. Romans faced winter with rituals, philosophical frameworks, and beliefs that gave suffering context. Stoic acceptance, religious festivals, military honor codes, these transformed hardship from meaningless affliction into test, challenge, opportunity for virtue. Modern secular culture sometimes struggles to provide similar frameworks. We experience hardship as purely negative, obstacle to overcome and forget. Perhaps we need new narratives and practices honoring challenge as part of meaningful existence. Not romanticizing suffering, but recognizing that being human involves confronting difficulty. That ease alone doesn't create flourishing, and that some of life's deepest satisfactions come from enduring and overcoming. Romans lived within environmental constraints they couldn't control. They adapted, innovated, organized collectively, but ultimately accepted that winter would come and demanded response. Modern technology created an illusion of transcending nature. We don't endure weather, we eliminate it. Climate change reminds us we remain subject to environmental forces larger than ourselves. Perhaps Roman acceptance and adaptation offer valuable models, not passive resignation but active engagement with reality as it exists rather than as we wish it to be. Every technique discussed, every Hippocrates system, every layering strategy, every shared meal and military tradition represents hard-won knowledge purchased with suffering and refined over generations. Romans who froze, who persevered, who survived left us this legacy. Honoring them means preserving and applying their wisdom, not just studying it as historical curiosity. In every Roman who woke in darkness, wrapped in wool, breathing frost, and chose to endure another day, lived proof of human capacity. Not for mere survival, animals survive, but for creating meaning, maintaining dignity, supporting others, and building civilization even in winter's depths. That capacity remains in modern humans. Dormant perhaps, unnecessary in climate-controlled comfort, but available when needed. We carry the same biology that kept Romans alive, the same potential for adaptation and endurance, the same need for community and meaning. The Roman winter story isn't just about past survival, it's about what humans are capable of when challenge demands it. It's about the knowledge that we're designed, by evolution, by culture, by the accumulated wisdom of countless generations, to endure far more than comfortable modern life requires. It's about recognizing that the ease we've created is precious, but perhaps shouldn't be taken for granted. That the skills and knowledge that kept ancestors alive through brutal winters remain valuable even when technology makes them unnecessary. That community and mutual support aren't just nice additions to life, but fundamental requirements for resilience and flourishing. And perhaps it's about gratitude for modern heating that spares us Roman hardship, yes, but also for the Romans who survived long enough to pass on their genes and knowledge, making our existence possible. Every person reading this descends from people who endured winter, who adapted, who persevered. That's your inheritance. On winter nights, when you adjust your thermostat or pull on an extra layer, you're part of an unbroken chain stretching back through centuries. Romans facing the same cold, making similar choices sustained by similar hopes. The technology's changed, but the fundamental human response, ingenuity, cooperation, resilience, the determination to endure and find light even in darkness, remains constant. That's the deepest lesson. Not how to survive winter without heating, but what being human means: adaptable, communal, resilient, and capable of creating warmth, literal and metaphorical, even when the world turns cold.